Ata Maria, colleagues, welcome to the Sustainability Committee meeting of Wednesday, the 7th of June at 9 a.m. Joined here by Administrative Support Sina and our advisor Sarah Claridge, and lead officer today is David Murphy, Chief Planning Officer, and would just acknowledge the members of ELT and officers in attendance here. You do need to know that this meeting is being recorded and streamed on the Council's YouTube channel. There are some health and safety requirements that we will point out to the member of the public who is here. That's around fire and emergency. If there is an alarm, please follow guidance from administrators and leave via the nearest exit, there being around the room. And the gathering place is Te Maraeohine at the clock tower in the center. Smoking is prohibited within any council public entrance or building. There's a defibrillator which is on the ground floor in the front of house in this building. And if there are any concerns, near misses or accidents, please do report those to a committee administrator. We do have some online participants today. Please first welcome, and please do keep your cameras on and microphones muted unless you're addressing the meeting. Councillors who will be hoping to use our electronic voting devices today, we'll see how that goes, and do advise any amendments through to staff. And if for some reason I don't introduce you when you come to the table, please do share your name and advise who you are before speaking. Just note that we have two councillors online today, Councillor Bowen and Councillor Hopata. I think that's us for housekeeping, so I will turn to Councillor Zabellan, Deputy Chair for Karakia Timitana.
Thank you. Tū taua mai I runga, tū taua mai I raro, tū taua mai I roto, tū taua mai I waho, kia tau ai te mauri te mauri ora, ki te katoa, haumie, huie, tae ki e.
Kia ora, thank you. Move now to look at apologies. We have apologies from the Mayor and Councillor Fitzgerald on council business, and Councillor Hancock for early departure. Are there any other apologies we need to note? There being none, I'll look to move that. Seconded by Councillor Zabellan, and ask for a vote. And that's 11 votes for and none against, and our devices seem to be working. Are there any additional items? I've not been notified of any. There appear to be none. Are there any declarations of interest for matters on today's agenda? Again, there appear to be none. That moves us to public comment. We do have a member of the public here to comment, Jackson Love from Flamingo Scooters. Welcome, Jackson. Thank you for traveling to Palmerston North and being willing to share a bit with us. Make yourself comfortable there. And the microphone in front of you, get it reasonably close, and you just hit the button in front of you and you'll get a bright green light, and we're in your hands for 3 minutes.
Awesome. I do have some slides as well. Righty, kia ora. My name's Jackson. I'm the co-founder and chief executive of Flamingo Scooters, the proudly Kiwi-owned and operated e-scooter sharing company. Our mission is to provide a first and last mile transport option that reduces reliance on cars, eases congestion on roads, and helps people get around in an environmentally friendly way. In a recent Palmy rider survey, 29% of Flamingo riders indicated that they would have otherwise made their most recent trip by motor vehicle if e-scooters were not available. 53% agreed that electric scooter sharing in Palmy makes it easier for them to not own a personal motor vehicle. Almost 2/3 of respondents had hired a Flamingo scooter to make a trip they otherwise wouldn't have made, and this increased travel in Palmy helps to stimulate the economy and support local businesses. I'm therefore speaking in support of the proposed recommendation and believe the renewal of e-scooter permits in Palmy helps to stimulate the economy, is in line with transport goals to reduce car reliance and carbon emissions. Flamingo partners closely and collaboratively with Palmerston North City Council, and we are passionate about the success of micromobility in Palmy. We believe it is the way of the future and will do everything we can to ensure the continued success of electric scooter sharing. This is why we have a number of safety measures and initiatives to ensure the highest level of safety, and in particular, that all scooters are parked safely. Preferred parking zones are where riders are incentivised to park in tidy and designated areas. Comprehensive in-app training includes rules to ensure scooters are parked and ridden in a safe and respectful manner. Our safety reward program has more detailed and specific safety rules, including training modules on safe parking. Onboard GPS allows us to enforce geo-fenced no parking zones in areas such as those with high foot traffic. Onboard sensors detect when scooters fall over. Our rapid response team are alerted and respond promptly to these scooters. All users are required to take parking photos, which are reviewed by our customer support team. Those parking safely receive incentives, whereas those found to be parking in an unsafe manner go through a strict escalation process. Flamingo runs regular Learn to Ride events to teach people firsthand how to safely ride and park scooters. These safety events are often in partnership with Palmy BID, Massey University and UCOL in order to reach people at events they are already attending. Flamingo rapid responders are available at all hours and attend to all reports of incorrectly parked scooters within 30 minutes. As a Kiwi-owned company, we are proud to contribute to local employment through our dedicated and growing team of safety ambassadors and rapid responders. We are invested in Palmerston North, proud of our collaborative partnership with Council and the local community, and will do everything we can to ensure the ongoing success of e-scooter sharing in Palmy. Thank you so much for listening. I now welcome any questions.
Great, thank you, Mr. Love. Appreciate you being here. We are on the time for 3 minutes, so we'll take one brief question from Councillor Johnson.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Jackson, for coming in and doing the presentation. I suppose I'm just interested to know from your perspective, you say you support the recommendation that we've got in the paper. Did you see any advantages for your company in a licensing system, or is the status quo, significantly better for you, and why is that?
I guess, yeah, that's not something we've given too much thought. I think, obviously, there could be advantages with a tender from our personal business perspective, but then again, who knows who will win that tender in the end, so we are quite happy with the status quo. I think it's working, so we don't see a need to change it.
Okay, thank you for that.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jackson. Just before you go, would it be all right to share this information with colleagues that aren't present today but
Absolutely.
on council? Great, thank you. If you could leave that with us. You're welcome to grab a seat in the gallery.
Awesome, thank you.
And listen in. Colleagues, we have the recommendation associated with public comment, which is that we receive it for information. I'll look to move that. Seconded by Councillor Zabellin, and we'll ask for a vote. And that's unanimous, which moves us on to confirmation of the minutes of the meeting of 29 March 2023. I'll look to move those. Seconded by Councillor Zabellin. Any points of correction? There being none, we will call for a vote. And that's unanimous, thanks. That moves us on to the substantive part of the agenda. A number of items, we might think of it as a bit of homework ahead of the long-term plan. A number of items coming to us today reporting back. The first, I would welcome David Watson to speak to us and introduce the report around opportunities for solar power on council-owned buildings.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning. Good morning, councillors. I'm happy to take the report as read. Just to mention that we are continuing in this area. We're going to keep on looking at more options and doing a more detailed analysis of the options that we have looked at to date, as part of the ongoing work that we do within the Low Carbon Fund, so working with the property and infrastructure teams. And there's likely to be more information on this coming up as part of the long-term plan sort of program development in the near future.
Fantastic, thank you. Anything from you, Adam, before questions?
Just, I suppose, to reiterate that, very much a desktop analysis. This is, as instructed, there is a lot of water to go under the bridge before any of these could be implemented as they are, just in terms of understanding, structural constraints and operational considerations and so forth. But it give you a bit of a sense of the scale of the opportunity.
Great, thank you. Open for questions, starting with Councillor Zabelin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both. At 1.3, your report talks about the operational returns of up to 1.5 million. Is that over the lifetime of the solar assets, or just in that sort of initial first year?
Yes. So, through you, Mr. Chair, we've taken the assumption that the panels will last their warranty lifetime, so 25 years, and that electricity costs will remain the same over that period, which is quite an assumption to make, really, as they're expected to go up. But taking those two things into account, you could say that over the life of the panels, that's the total amount that we would save, sort of net saving.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Mr. Chair.
Councillor Hancock.
Sorry, just one more point on that last.
Yep.
That's also including costs, interest costs on the upfront capital. And so there's a discount rate applied to future earnings.
Great. Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you, David. So I just have got a question. Do you have any further comment just around sort of the general viability of the sites that we actually have? Like, it seems to me, orientation to north, size of the building. There's a whole combination of different things there which perhaps make some sites more viable than others. So do we have any more sort of context around that?
So this report deals exclusively with the desktop analysis that was done. So we did not do any site visits. We've not done any structural assessments of any of the buildings. And we've not looked at the wiring or the inverters in those buildings. This is purely a case of, is their roof big enough and do they use power sufficiently that it's worth doing a further investigation, essentially. And having said that, we have looked at some other buildings, this building in particular, and the buildings at the arena in more detail, and it seems like, at least in those instances, it is a viable proposition. But we're going to have to take all of these things on a case-by-case basis, because until you get up into the roof space, it's hard to say exactly how much weight the roof could take. And until you get into the details of the wiring of the buildings, it's hard to know if you could fit a modern inverter into that system without additional cost. That's not to say that those aren't viable projects. The amount of money that's being saved over the lifetime of the panels, in some cases, is substantial. So it might well be the case that the upfront cost would increase. It may be that there's a cost to have a crane come in to put the panels up in the first place. And there will be a detailed analysis done before any money is spent to actually do these things, just to make sure that they will pay for themselves over the lifetime of the panels. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it.
And through you, just to add to that, to perhaps answer in a more general sense, I think what you do see in the report is that, as you pointed out, buildings that have a north-facing aspect, that are angled towards the sun vertically, and have a larger on-site energy usage to match solar that's installed are the ones that are most cost-effective. The more that you have to sell energy back to the grid, you oversize your solar array, the less cost-effective they become. The more that you're facing away from north, the less effective they become. There's a sort of a complicated but not overly complex, but complicated analysis that goes into it. Each site, looking at those different factors, you kind of, draw a whole range of cost curves, and you can kind of see that as you go away from those kind of ideal factors, it's still plenty of opportunity, but it just becomes progressively kind of more marginal, I guess you would say, as you move away from those ideal conditions.
Great, thank you. It's very helpful, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Oops. Thanks, David. Adam. I've just got a couple of questions. The first one is, and I understand this is outside the scope of the report, but has there been any thought about putting like a solar array not on a building? In other words, on some land that council has that might be better positioned for solar power generation?
Yes, is a short answer. It's not what we've done through this report, as I said. I think there are, again, desktop analysis, and I'm not in a position to share any information around that at the moment, but that is an opportunity that we're looking at. I think it's likely to have some merit in some cases, although there's more work that needs to be done in order to prove that. But essentially it's the same thing, as long as you're feeding into a facility that's utilising energy, but instead of putting it on the roof, you put them on the ground. There's advantages and disadvantages to that. Obviously you don't need to worry about structural issues and so forth, but there's potentially other operational considerations in terms of maintenance and so forth. So it's just a very similar thing ultimately. It's just it's implemented in a slightly different way.
But it has to be adjacent to the building where the power would be used, does it? We don't have the option of having, I guess you'd call it like a little mini solar farm somewhere.
I think that would be a very different proposition, trying to sell effectively into the grid there, or to install large transmission lines into other facilities, at which point you'd be trying to compete with a large generator market, be a kind of a different raft of considerations. I think, I don't know if I could say much more than that, but it would a solar farm would be a different proposition, I guess, is the point I'm making.
Okay. Thank you. And then my other question is just about the cost. So there's a sort of tentative figure of $900,000 in here. And given that the low carbon fund is only $1 million, I mean, that would be all of it almost. And then in 3.3, you've given a few possible options for funding. So you've said either through the low carbon fund or its own budget, or as part of an future annual budget, which I suppose is the same sort of thing. Do you have an opinion as to the best way to fund this? Is it better funded through a larger low carbon fund, or is it better funded with its own programme line?
I won't offer an opinion on here in terms of how, we could do some analysis, but in terms of how it might be best funded. What I will say in terms of 3.3 is, just to unpack what we're talking about there a little more, is that the intention here is to continue to use the low carbon fund in the way that it's been designed, and there'll be a report coming to you next financial year, I think in August, around that. So, for example, a new building's being developed, where solar's not budgeted, we run through the process, find that solar's in a, very advantageous for that facility, and that's something that, stacks up really well, and we fund that through the low carbon fund. On the other hand, what we're seeing is obviously there's a lot of interest around solar at the moment, so our intention over the next 12 months is to go away and do a more detailed analysis of what the costs are likely to be, and then come back with a program to you for consideration through the long-term plan.
Okay. Thanks, Mr Chair. Thank you.
Online, Councillor Harpiter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just looking at the report on the appendix on page 15,
Here.
with the 3 swimming pools, is this the expected amount that we would, for emissions that we would expect, comparing it to other cities if we were to put solar panels on the 3 pools?
Sorry, councillor. Could I just ask you to, you're cutting in a little out a bit at the start of that question. I couldn't quite hear you.
So looking at attachment 1,
Right.
so you've got the three pools listed at Ashurst, Freiburg and the Lido, with those 3 swimming pools there. If we compare those to pools in other cities and solar power collected in other cities, would that be the expected emissions that you'd receive from, have we done any work of what other cities receive in terms of emissions?
Okay. I can answer. The first answer is we haven't been looking at other pool facilities at other cities in terms of their emissions, although that's information that I know in some cases is publicly available, so if that's of interest to you, we could get that information to you. These emissions in the third column, these figures in the third column, which more precise than probably they should be. But what this is indicating is the annual emissions reductions at each of those facilities were the solar to be implemented as it's described in this report. So if we went ahead and did the Ashurst solar farm as it is, later in the report, Ashurst pool, sorry, the expectation is there that would save roughly 8.8 tonnes of carbon per annum from PNCC's inventory. So it's not a comparative to other pools, but like I said, we can look around and give you some information around that if you're interested.
But the pools are the areas where we do tend to save more emissions than other areas.
The pools are, in general, some of our most energy-intensive facilities, and so to be able to offset the energy that's used there with solar there's a significant opportunity, should we say? All else remaining the same.
And are they the best position in terms of this facing the sun to collect the solar energy?
I think that's quite varies quite substantially depending on the site, and like I said, there's more work to be done on that front. But certainly there, on the surface of it, there certainly seems to be some opportunity there.
Okay, thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Councillor Findlay.
Thank you. I was having a look at some of the buildings and the plans on the roofs. Places like the Ashurst Hall and 1 or 2 other places like that. Firstly, have you thought about batteries?
So at present, the design of these systems is that they would produce energy, and whenever there is more energy being produced than there is being used, they would sell the surplus back into the grid.
Yep.
Because that's the simplest type of solar system, and it's also the cheapest in terms of upfront installation cost. as you'll see from if you look at attachment 2, there are little graphs on the left-hand side with red and yellow graphs that show you where the consumption and production is in each of these systems. And you could theoretically put batteries in so that where you're consuming energy but not producing energy, you can spread that out over a longer time period. But the upfront cost for installing that system is A, higher, and B, less easy to predict from a desktop analysis. It might well be the case that if we look at these in more detail, we would come up with multiple options, either a purely usage system feeding back into the grid, or a small battery system or a large battery system, depending on what's the most cost-effective way of covering our usage.
Okay, so have we got any idea what kilowatt hour how much we'll get per kilowatt hour if we sell it back to the grid?
I wouldn't want to get pinned down to a figure off the top of my head.
Yeah.
My understanding is it's quite a bit less than the cost to buy it with. So without a full agreement with PowerCo, we'd have to agree that with them, I would think, at the time.
Okay.
The default rate in 2020, I believe, was about 4 cents per kilowatt hour, just so it's about a fifth. Just one small point on batteries. Where batteries are most useful, and again, just speaking in a general sense here, is where you're generating power during the day and then utilising that power at night. So like a residential home, for example. Most of our facilities, and quite happily for us, from our perspective, are utilising or have the highest demand for energy at the same time as they're producing the highest demand, which means we could save, in most cases, on the cost of batteries. But again, it would be a case of just looking at each one on the case-by-case basis, and if there's a business case to be made of, well, look, we could spend a little bit more up front here, or quite a bit more, in order to save a little bit more over time. That's certainly something we'd look at. But I would say, in general, given that most of our facilities are shut at night, they're producing electricity during the day, the solar arrays would, and then they'd be utilising it directly. So there'd be less of need for batteries than, say, at a residential house.
Yeah. Also, with the batteries, like for this building, for example, we have batteries here. At night, when there's limited power being used, but there is power being used, the batteries would supply that power, wouldn't it? And again, the batteries can charge at night via the grid at the lowest price range. That you time it so the charges it when the power is at the lowest price, correct?
Yes, there's some arbitrage opportunities there, potentially, but that's not something that we've looked at through this.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Just a couple of questions from me. This report paints quite a positive picture, which stands a bit in contrast to some of the reports we've received historically about the performance of the solar assets on this building. As we're moving towards investment decisions, is there going to be any work done to kind of reconcile those two narratives so we really understand where we're at?
I think that the really easy answer there is just that the cost of solar has declined dramatically, and would have been good if I'd known the question was coming to show you some graphs of that. But when the solar array on this building was deployed, I think something in the order of about 17 years ago, the cost per kilowatt installed was about 100 times more than it is now, just for this panel. So a lot of the cost is in installation, and those costs haven't necessarily changed. But that's just something that we've seen globally. There's been just enormous advances in engineering and technology, scale of the design and manufacture of the panels. So it's a conversation we've had a couple of times over the last few years of seeing a tipping point occur in terms of in New Zealand, at our latitude, given our cloud cover conditions and so on, our average conditions here, seeing that the economic case is now, in the naive sense, again, without going into the detail, starting to look quite positive, where it wasn't necessarily even 5 years ago.
Great, thank you. And in terms specifically of the performance issues, aside from the economics of it, the performance issues that we experienced with the solar arrays here, you're comfortable that we wouldn't be going down those same sort of paths? Or is there somebody else that might want to speak to that has some experience in that space?
We could possibly offer some general comments, or would you like to speak to it, Bryce, or you could... All right. Well, just simply to say that the state of understanding when the solar panels on the roof was first installed was quite, limited in terms of both the analysis and the state of the installation industry and so forth, far less mature than it is now. One of the really glaring examples of that was just the orientation that they were placed on the roof, flat, so that water pools on them and it causes all sorts of maintenance issues. That's, something that probably shouldn't have happened 17 years ago, but certainly would never happen now. You never see, things installed like that anywhere you go in the country. So I think we could have a reasonable degree of confidence that that would not occur. But I guess just to note, when those were first installed, it was very... I think at the time it was the largest installation in the Southern Hemisphere, clearly wanting to push the barrow out and explore the opportunity. But unfortunately the downside of that has been that they've underperformed.
Great, thank you. Bryce.
Yes, Bryce Hosking, Group Manager of Property and Resource Recovery. Probably the only thing I would add is we've actually had some very positive conversations just recently about the panels on this roof and also the Conference and Function Centre. A lot more positive than we've had previously, which I think speaks to Adam's point around technology has changed. We've gotten better at it in terms of how these are done, and there's a bit of creative thinking coming from a supplier on how we might be able to actually turn the corner a bit and get some pretty drastic improvements to how they're performing at the moment, which is really positive.
Great, thank you both. That takes us to the end of questions. So. Except for a very late reappearance in the queue. Councillor Findlay.
It just came to mind when we just heard that bit of information from the staff. Have you looked at leasing instead of buying?
Not through this report. I think that analysis would be slightly different, but would be unlikely to change dramatically. Obviously, the upfront capital costs would be lower in that case, but it would be zero in theory, or depending on the nature of the arrangement. But that the overall the operational returns would be lower as well, right? Because we're paying to lease them instead of owning them outright. So, in effect, I think there's a relatively simple analysis that could be done in terms of your expectations there, and if we could get back to you around some indicative figures if you're interested.
Yeah. It would be interesting to see the figures on leasing, and it would spread the payments over 20 years.
Is there a further question there?
That's just say it would be interesting to see a report with leasing.
Thank you for that comment. There don't appear to be any further questions. Thank you to officers for your participation. Don't go too far. We have the recommendation in front of us that the committee resolves that the findings of the report titled Desktop Analysis of Opportunities for Solar Panel on Council-Owned Buildings and further detailed investigations of opportunities for solar power on council buildings be referred to the 2434 long-term plan process, which I'll look to move, seconded by Councillor Zabellan, and open up for any comments. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I thought this was a very helpful and timely report and was quite encouraged by it, I must say. And I would like to see more information about how we can do this, come back to the long-term plan. But I wonder, with your permission, if we could perhaps just not include only on council buildings, because I think that we're quite limiting ourselves if we're only looking at solar panels on roofs. And there are other opportunities for solar panels that we could explore that are out with just being on a building. So I just wonder whether it's worth just broadening the scope of that a little bit further, but I will leave that to you. In terms of just generally, I think, you know, the officers made some very good comments about how technology has improved over time. And I wouldn't like to see the fact that the solar panels on this building, which were installed right at the beginning of this kind of technology being available here, the fact that they haven't been a stunning success shouldn't deter us from pursuing this as an option now. Times have changed, technology's changed, and I think there were lots of comments in the report, and also the officers made comments about why things are different now compared to how they used to be. So I just would hope that we could keep an open mind on this and be able to use the you know, the information that might come back through the detailed investigation to think about how we could expand on the use of solar power at council. And the other comment I just wanted to make was just about how this might be financed, because in terms of the cost, there was a sort of an indicative cost in the paper, but that on its own would eat up most of the low carbon fund. And so whether we continue to fund our carbon reduction policies entirely, well, not policies, carbon reduction actions entirely through the low carbon fund, or whether we need a series of different budget lines, I'm not 100% sure. And I think I'd be interested to hear from officers about the best way to fund this going forward. Because clearly the low carbon fund is entirely, it's just a fund, and then officers determine how it's used, whereas a specific line for solar panels might or might not be better, and I'm not really clear on the answer to that at the moment. Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you, Councillor. Without seeing the specific language that was on your mind, I think I'd be favourably disposed. There are a couple other speakers in the queue. Could you get the language to the admin and we can look at it in due course? Councillor Findlay?
Yeah, thank you. I've become quite a fan of solar energy lately. Even in the middle of winter, you can save a third of your power bill by having solar panels. I would be interested to see what the cost to council would be on the leasing of solar panels, because the new systems where you can lease them for 20 years, the maintenance, there's no maintenance on them. The maintenance is taken care of the company you're leasing from. It's a very cheap way of doing it. There's no capital outlay, so there'd be no interest on the money we'd have to borrow. We'd be saving there. It could be quite an interesting exercise to have a look at leasing as much as we can. That also would include the batteries. So I think we just had a look at buying. Today, I think leasing is also a good way out as well. So I'd be interested to see if any further reports come back where the possibilities of leasing are also considered.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Zabelin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, what I enjoy most about this report and the potential that it offers us is that we do have the potential to insulate ourselves against the cost of power and electricity and whatever that is going to do, but the trends show steadily going upwards. That puts us in a position where we do have options rather than just being price takers and building that into our rates every year. That gives us a lot more flexibility to move. I think there is also a really important resilience aspect, especially when you look at Hancock House the Awapuni Community Centre, Highbury Whānau Centre, lots of those buildings are used at night, and the solar panels proposed in this report look like they would account for a lot of their power usage, so that could be, different tool for a different job. I think it is worth exploring batteries for specific types of buildings. As the officer said, it's a case-by-case sort of thing, but as an overall long-term strategy for the long-term plan, I think that this puts us in a better position to be insulated against whatever the market is doing before it really starts to hurt us. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you, colleagues. I'll just briefly summarize to say thanks to officers for the work. It's obviously the first stage in some more detailed work, and you can get a sense from the comments around the table about the anticipation that we have looking forward to this with more information coming into the long-term plan process. But very good to see what we might call a sunny report for solar PV for the council and the community's future. So thank you to officers again for the work done. And we will now look to see if we yet have our revised language. Looks like it's still in process, so we'll give staff a moment to work that through.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I think that's in the wrong location. It should be in after the second council building.
Yeah, we'll give staff just a second to get the right words in the right places. Is that what you had intended, Councillor? Great, thank you. Are you comfortable
If you're happy with that, yeah.
Yeah, I think both Seconder and I would be happy to just absorb that in the substantive. And just check with officers, given this is potentially change in scope, if there's any comment around that.
No, I think this is okay. I guess what I would say is the focus for next financial year is likely to be on those 14 buildings, given that the low carbon fund is obviously, as has been commented, got a certain quantum, and there will be other demands placed on that. So the focus, I think, in the next financial year and the lead up to LTP will be further investigations of those 14 buildings, but that's not to say the lessons that we learn from the delivery of those projects can't then be applied to our broader understanding of the delivery of solar beyond next financial year.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, could I just
ask a question?
I guess a point of clarification. By other locations, I just mean other than on top of a building. That's all I mean. It could be the same buildings that are being looked at, but I'm cautious of us going down a very narrow track of looking to put solar on top of a building and then coming back with a report that says, oh, the structure of this building is such that we can't put solar on it, and then we've missed an opportunity to look at solar panels on the ground nearby. That's all I'm trying to cover, that's all.
That's fine.
Yeah, understood, thank you. No further comments, so we will call for a vote, thank you. And that's passed 11 votes for with 1 abstaining. We'll move now to item 8 on the agenda, which is the City Council Organizational Emissions Inventory, and invite David Watson, Climate Change Analyst, back to present on this, and joined by Adam Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a short presentation to show you on this. I would like to point out at the outset that this is a good news story. Some of the elements of it might sound like bad news, but it's more caution than negativity, and hopefully that comes across. So, from the report, you recognise these graphs. So this is the organisational emissions inventory history, essentially, going back to when we first started producing inventories. The large blue block at the bottom is the maturation of our closed landfills. So this is the same graph with that big blue block taken off to show the more kind of active elements of council's emission sources. And this is the same information presented as a line graph rather than as a bar chart. So the blue line at the top is our total emissions including landfills, and the red line at the bottom is our total emissions excluding landfills. And the green dotted line is what we would expect our emissions to be if we are to hit our target of a 30% reduction by 2031. If you then extrapolate that line out to 2031, you'll see that we would expect to be hitting around 18,510 tonnes of carbon emitted in 2031. We're currently emitting around 19,000, and we would expect, just from landfill maturation alone, that to go down by another 660 in the 2022-23 financial year, which is just coming to an end. So the news on this point is we have yet to produce a report on it, but by now the data tells us that we've probably hit our 2030-31 target. Well ahead of schedule. This is where it starts to get a less positive. So this is, again, the same information again, but compared against our operating revenue. So this is our tons of carbon per dollar spent graph. So again, we were spending a lot more per ton earlier on, and that has gone down and down and down, which is the other way around. We'll be becoming more efficient, which is, again, good news. And all of this, particularly the difference between our landfill maturation emissions and the rest of our emissions, is brought together in this graph. So the reason why we can be confident that we have hit our target, even though the inventory that we're presenting to you now isn't quite there yet, is because the emissions that come from our landfill are calculated rather than measured. Do you disagree? A close estimate on best, best information.
On past measures, yeah. Sorry, just a small.
So the period that we're looking at is this bit. So this covers for the 2016 to 2022 period, and you can see it's quite a steep downward line. So without us doing an enormous amount extra, the landfill on its own is producing less and less methane over time. Obviously, we're capturing some of that now, which is a very positive thing. But going forward into the future, without going into kind of novel technologies, that's going to keep going down at a steady rate, and our emissions overall will keep going down at a steady rate as well. So to return to this graph, excluding the emissions from landfill, which are going down more or less on their own, the rest of our emissions are more level. So whilst the good news is our emissions are coming down, and the very good news is we're going to likely to hit our target, if not this current financial year, then certainly next financial year. Our ability to influence the other emissions of council outside of landfill are not providing quite such stellar results. And I have some more specific examples if you'd like, but that's essentially where we're at for now.
Great.
So if I could just offer a few points. Just one point of clarification on the landfill model was designed prior to David Watson's arrival, so that was done by me. So just to clarify his comments there. So there, essentially impossible to measure emissions from a landfill, because you'd have to put a big old, it's happening across the entire space, right? So there's small, tiny amounts of leakage that's happening from the cap on the top. We capture as much of that as we can, we measure that, and then there's a model that we've developed in order to estimate what we miss, essentially. If we could, and so that's based on what we're capturing and what we know of the waste that was put into the landfill over its lifetime, until it was closed in 2007. And so just to make that clarification, just one other point regarding the inventory. So in case it was missed, so thinking of the non-landfill emissions here, and we'll just go back to, we won't. If you look at figure 1.3 on page 28, for example, the key here is, the key takeaway here is that we have been in a position where we're levelling out our emissions, our non-landfill emissions. Oh, sorry, David. Here. But that this is part of a continued decline in emissions intensity. So the, per unit activity that the council does, per dollar of revenue, we're continuing to see a decline, but we're a lot of the low-hanging fruit of the first few years that we're seeing quite significant emission reductions, as you can see in those first few years, which were, we've talked about in the past, but just to remind your councillors, were things like, pretty dramatic efficiency approvals at the wastewater treatment plant, no longer paying for some buildings that, electricity bills that we weren't leasing, and things of that nature. When you first do an inventory, you uncover all sorts of interesting things about the organisation, and so we had a couple of years there where some really easy wins, and we're now at the stage where the work is a little bit, more diffuse across the organisation in terms of, rather than one or two large wins, replacing all the streetlights with LEDs can be done in a fell swoop. It's throughout the entire organisation. So, just to perhaps give you a bit of flavour around what we're seeing here now. So, just another,
Thank you. Thank you both. There are a number of questions in the queue, starting with Councillor Naylor.
Thank you for the report. I'm just looking at the inventory attachment 1, page 33, and on the third page of that, on page 35, there is workplace travel / air travel, and then it says air travel domestic, and then a few lines down it also says air travel domestic, and I'm just wondering, do we capture international travel in our inventory at all?
So the line that reads workplace travel, air travel, that is travel for work, including international travel, that sort of thing. It does say air travel domestic. That is actually all air travel.
Okay.
And then, so there is air travel for staff commuting is 0 because nobody commutes by aeroplane.
there was a period in a previous inventory where someone was commuting by airplane on a regular basis, so that was in the previous inventory. That's no longer occurring now, so you'll see that line drop off in future inventories. But you'll continue to see air travel as part of council business carry on for as long as that remains part of council's activity.
So on the top one where it says domestic, does that need to be corrected?
That's a typo. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two questions. One, the first one is around the measure that we have for our landfill. Is that standard across the country so we can have some confidence in the peer review of how we're measuring that?
So that's an IPCC standard model that we're using, yeah.
Yep, okay, thank you. And my second question is around the impacts of lockdown. Just with what I'm looking at on your graph, the travel and having the lights on the building, I would have thought would have been out and been quite a noticeable change. I know there was a dip in that year, but have you got any commentary around the impact of the lockdowns?
Now, a year ago, we got into this question quite significantly, as there was a fair, obviously a lot of interest at that time while we were still in the thing, and when that inventory was first presented. The summary of that is that although workplace travel certainly did decline during that time, and with a number of buildings being shut and so forth, there were other emissions that actually had to increase quite dramatically, particularly generator usage and so forth during the period that made that offset those reductions. I can provide you with further detail and refer you back to the previous year's report on that, which goes into further detail. But it was the impact of COVID lockdowns on council emissions were more complex than I think any of us anticipated, it'd be fair to say.
Okay, I'm happy with that response. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the report. I'm just interested to understand, given that we've got the low carbon fund for capital items, whether or not we need a similar fund or programme to address, I guess, what you might call sort of non-capital changes that could be made that would affect the carbon emissions. So up until now, we've sort of looked at, solid infrastructure like replacing a boiler or whatever. But are there other, perhaps, less tangible, maybe, programs that we need to be introducing that would help with carbon reduction?
I would say, in the general sense, all of our emissions come from some activity, right? So if most of that is the result of assets, hence, capital being the current low carbon fund as a capital budget. Some of wherever there is a emissions associated or that need to be addressed through an operating program, I would suggest that all else remaining the same, the way to address that would be through whatever budgets are associated with that activity as it stands, rather than having some portion of a budget to address emissions for another activity sitting over here that's going to have to change in order to reduce emissions through that activity, if that makes sense. I think you end up sort of making it administratively more difficult. Just as a general comment. Yeah.
No, thank you, and I take that point. But let's say we wanted to address emissions of workplace travel, for instance. I can't see how you could do that through a capital budget, and it isn't even really something that council itself pays for. So it would seem to me that if you want to address that, it needs to be through more of an educational approach or an incentivised approach, or, that there's a different approach that's required there compared to, the approach we're taking with the low carbon fund.
Yes, absolutely. And so I guess, that would be a situation in which we would be looking to, just thinking back to there's a range of different ways that one might address workplace travel. And I think, better provision of, bike cage, for example, has been achieved. There's other kind of things as a council that we do in terms of provision for active transport infrastructure and so forth. So there's a whole range of different elements that go into, that workplace travel and affect citywide workplace travel and so forth. And so we wouldn't want to necessarily go down any one particular route without understanding the whole, but I do, I guess, acknowledge your point that some of the options for reducing those emissions would be operating in nature. And so, there's one of the pieces of work that we'll be doing over the next year is to understand those different opportunities and then bring those forward through the upcoming LTP process for your consideration.
Okay. Thank you. That's great. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, colleagues. Just one further question from me would be around understanding your views on the, I guess, relevance of an organizational target that kind of amalgamates the automatic side of things, which is the landfill, with the discretionary investment needed side of things, which is the balance of organizational emissions, as we look to the future in terms of hopefully wanting to maximize our emissions reductions.
So elected members might recall that last year we presented a so-called zero carbon feasibility study, which presented 4 different pathways forward for the organisation to becoming zero carbon by 2050. We were subsequently instructed to come back with a more detailed analysis, which will be coming back to the next iteration of this committee. So one of the options for in front of you at that committee would be to, or perhaps more appropriately through the long-term plan as a result of that piece, taking into account the information that we presented, that updated feasibility study, one of your decisions through the next LTP would be perhaps to choose one of those pathways as council's preferred pathway, which would then set an organisational target.
Great, thank you. That's helpful. There's no further questions, so yeah, thank you again, and grab a seat, don't go too far. We have the recommendation in front of us. The committee resolves to note that as a result of council actions, PNCC emissions have fallen from 26,444 tonnes of CO2 equivalent in 2015-16 to 19,001 tonnes of CO2 equivalent in 21-22, being a 28% reduction, which I'll look to move. Seconded by Councillor Zabellin, and open up for any comments. Turning first to Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess I just wanted to say that this is good news, and I sense there's a kind of a feeling that somehow, because some of it has happened automatically through the maturation of the landfill, that somehow we don't deserve it. But in fact, a tonne of carbon is a tonne of carbon. It doesn't matter where that carbon comes from or where it was generated or not generated. A saving is a saving. So I do think it is worth at least a little celebration. I totally understand that we don't want to be complacent and say, well, because since our emissions are reducing automatically through maturation of the landfill, we don't have to do anything else about it. Absolutely, I'm not saying that. And I do think, I thought it was very useful to have the 2 graphs, the 2 charts with the landfill included and then with it taken out. And I take on board, the comments about it's going to become increasingly difficult to achieve reductions. But nevertheless, the sort of key to understanding how you might do it is to have the information about where the emissions are coming from and to have now several years of data that we can compare with, I think is really, really useful. So I'm very grateful for the report and the clear expertise that we have now on staff, which is fantastic. I love it when the experts are debating themselves. It's great. You know, it's really useful, and I think it is a space that we're growing into, and there's still scope for improvement, totally, but let's just be glad that we have got to where we've got to now and look to see how we can continue to improve. And if that means expanding the low carbon fund, if it means looking at how operational programs can be more efficient in terms of carbon, then I'm open to that. But I think let's at least take a breath today and be happy that we've got this far. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Chair. I also just want to acknowledge the results and pause to actually celebrate them in some respects. When we first set out on this journey, I think there's a lot of unknowns about how we would actually go and what we're actually measuring. But as we've gone on, I think there's been an educational part as well that has built confidence around what we're doing here. These figures do have some standards across them that are universal across, so we can have some confidence with the landfill measure. And that's a great result, actually. And so therefore, I think Councillor Johnson's really put mind to the wider aspects around the low carbon footprint fund that we have and some of the other initiatives that we can be more ambitious around what we're wanting to hit as a target. Yeah, for my mind, I find it's quite gratifying, but also quite confirming that we're on the right track. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Zabellan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, likewise, I think Councillor Johnson summed it up, all my sentiments, very nicely. The numbers go down. That's what we want. I think we really are going down the right path, and it's great to take a moment to celebrate what we have achieved and to steel up for the next part, because sometimes it does seem too big, and there are much bigger emitters, bigger players in the field than us, are doing more damage. But to take ownership of the pollution that we do, because emissions is effectively pollution, so actually looking at taking responsibility for the pollution that we do create and taking the commitment to make that go down, setting a really good example for others that even though you might be a small fish in the global picture, that doesn't mean you can't take responsibility for what you are contributing and work really hard to make those numbers go down. So I'm really pleased with this report. It was great. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, colleagues. Firstly, thank you for your very positive perspective around this, and well agree with you that there is a celebration to be had around what has been achieved, and it's pretty stunning actually when you look at the numbers from 26 coming down to 19. That is a tangible savings in terms of emissions, which is fantastic to see that accruing over time, and should and is being well celebrated, at least here in this committee today. Thank you to officers for the continued significant work that you do in this report and bringing it to us and giving us good visibility across what's happening both on the landfill side but also the non-landfill side. And I think my perspective around the non-landfill side is I am looking forward to a future where we can be celebrating a very steady progress sustained across multiple years there. What we've seen is that in that space, as council officers have identified, the easy wins are kind of done and we're kind of bouncing around about, and we really do need to make sure that we're setting a trajectory in the next few years that sees a steady and predictable decline on the non-landfill side, very parallel to the sort of decline curve that we're seeing on the landfill side emissions. But yes, thanks again to officers, and a great report. With that, we will call for a vote. Thank you. And that's unanimous, 12 votes for. We will take a slightly different order here just to take advantage of Mr. Love's continued presence here and to give Mr. Jarvis a little bit of a break. If we could ask Peter Ridge to join us, this is around item 10, e-scooters, review of performance in Palmerston North 21 to 23, and I understand there may be a presentation here as well, Peter. Yeah, over to you when you're ready. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So yeah, this report for you is about the performance of e-scooters in the city over the last 17 months. So the genesis of this is a decision that the council made just over a year ago. We came to the council seeking approval for a report for an amendment to the Signs and Public Places bylaw. The rationale for that was we believed there was a need to change the way we regulated e-scooters, creating a dedicated licensing system that would limit the number of operators, the number of e-scooters, and also introduce a code of practice and create some fee-setting powers. The decision of the council at the time was to not make any changes, to remove the limits on the number of operators and e-scooters, and to report back in a year's time with some more data on how things were going. So that's why we're here. The purpose of this report is not to recommend a particular course of action, but just to give that data the council was requesting and to know where we are with that. So I'm just going to take you through some of this data that we've got. All the information's in the report, but this one here I think is quite a useful slide to show some of the data that is available. Ride Report is a company that collates data under contract from Whakatahi for micromobility services. So this is data that's ingested by by Ride Report from each of the operators. This slide just shows like an overview of the entire city and the kind of the hot spots for the routes around the city. You can see some of the figures down the bottom there. So we have, at the time of this screenshot, 595 vehicles with a total number of trips since November 2021. Over 439,000 trips, with a total distance of over 921,000 kilometres. We can also drill down into Palmerston North specific data, and I would encourage you, if you're interested, to go and have a look at this. This is a public dashboard. Anybody can go online and have a look at this, and the URL is there for you to take a look. When going through this, it was interesting to note where Palmerston North sits in a number of key metrics in relation to other cities where e-scooters are available. We have the fourth largest fleet in the country. The third largest fleet in the country. We have 595 more than Wellington, though they do have a higher number of average trips per vehicle per day, which does suggest perhaps that there is a slight oversupply in Palmerston North, but nevertheless our trips per vehicle per day are still quite substantial there. We have an average number of trips per day at the time of this report is 900. Which again is quite substantial. We looked at complaints. These are the complaints that the council's received through our call centre. More generally, we call these requests for service, so they're not necessarily complaints, they may just be issues that need to be addressed. Unsurprisingly, the number one is parking. This is where someone may have left an e-scooter in an appropriate location and may be causing an issue. As you'll see with, I think I may have this on the next slide, the time of these requests for service is also useful to note in relation to that first slide. So over half of those complaints were received in the first month of e-scooters being here. Not unsurprising, it's a new thing. It's obviously going to generate a lot of attention, a lot of interest, and a lot of those were parking complaints in that first month as people were getting used to the fact of e-scooters being around. But as you can see, there's a sharp drop-off after those first couple of months, and ever since, the number of complaints has been relatively low and static. We do see some issues with unsafe riding, again, not unexpected, but if you look at the rest of the types of requests that we've received, in all cases they're relatively low numbers, which is encouraging to see that we haven't had some of the deep concerns that some people had about e-scooters coming into the city. We also looked at data from police. They were kind enough to make available the reports that they had where e-scooters were involved. There were a encouragingly low number of reports that they had received. And again, they don't have a particular reporting category for e-scooters, so this is where an e-scooter has been mentioned in another incident report. There were 8 vehicle and e-scooter collisions recorded. This is over the period from November through to March, November 21 to March 2023. So it's a 17-month period. And there were a couple of incidents of unsafe riding. But again, these numbers are quite low, which is something that we felt was, again, quite encouraging. None of these incidents are desirable, of course, but again, we just want to enforce that these are numbers that are quite low. We asked ACC for some data on the number of claims, and again, not unsurprising, it has gone up in the calendar year for 2022. It's a new type of transport, and as we've seen in other cities, there are claims associated with e-scooters. What we did find encouraging, though, was that while they couldn't provide us with specific details about the injuries, they were able to give us an indication of the type and severity, and there were no what they would classify as serious injuries. Most of them were minor to moderate. We've asked for data from the operators on the key measures that we require them to report to us. So we've seen here, we characterise 2 different types of parking issues. So the first is where an e-scooter is parked or left to cause a hazard or nuisance. This is where it may be parked across the footpath or fallen over or something like that, where there's an obstacle to people using the footpath. But we also look for instances where people may be complaining about an e-scooter put in the wrong place, but it's not necessarily causing a hazard or nuisance. Again, not unsurprisingly, there's a higher number in those first few months as the service became spread throughout the city, but we have seen those start to generally tail off as the service has become more commonplace. We also asked the operators to let us know when there are unsafe or faulty e-scooters. So this could be something that is reported by a user through the app or telephone directly to them. The metric that we asked them to report is that when these reported to them, that they immediately deactivate the e-scooter so it can't be used, and then they take it off the streets for maintenance and servicing. And they've been 100% compliant in that for all these complaints. We also did a compliance audit of the permit conditions for all 3 operators. This was undertaken December last year. So we looked at the key areas of the permit where we have set requirements for them, and we did kind of like a mystery shopper experience where we went out and we activated the e-scooters to test that they were compliant with the conditions of the permit. We found generally good results. The first category there, areas of operation, this is where they are compliant with the geofencing that we've set up. And what we found is that in all cases there were some inconsistencies. So in some cases they would be ridden into an area where they're supposed to slow down, and they either don't slow down at the area we expect them to, or they may not slow down enough. So in all of those cases we looked at the way those geofences were set up in the apps and have tried to find a more consistent way of dealing with that. So those have all now been updated in the apps for the various operators, and we'll be going out soon to check to make sure that those are all updated and correct. The cognitive test is something that was introduced about a year ago, no, just over a year ago, and this is for e-scooters that are being activated after 9 p.m. on Fridays and Saturdays, and it's an attempt to mitigate the risks of intoxicated riding. We asked each of the operators to implement this cognitive test. Of the 3, only 1 hadn't at the time that we tested it. 1 had a cognitive test that we thought could be beefed up a little bit, but they've all been very cooperative in addressing that, and again, that's something else that we'll be going out to check to make sure that's been implemented. They were very generally good with the way that e-scooters were placed for hire, so when they go out and place them themselves. We found it quite hard to test the parking by users, because in order to do that, we need to then follow up how they respond to complaints of incorrect parking. So that's something we'll be looking at for future compliance checks. And the public education safety campaigns generally very good. One operator, we couldn't find any information about their public educational safety campaigns, so we passed that feedback on to them and asked them to take steps in that direction. And I believe that's it. So the intention of this report is to give you an overview of how things are going, and I think the conclusion that we've reached is that while the situation is not perfect, but nothing ever is, the way the operators have performed in the city and the number of issues we've seen are either what we would have expected to see or they've been addressed adequately. The reason for this whole process starting off was that we believed that there was a need to change the way that things are regulated. Based on this information, we don't believe that that's necessary, and we think that the current approach is working as expected, and that we should remain with status quo. So we're not bringing the bylaw that we had a year ago back to you. We believe that as things stand, they should continue. The issue of the permit is under the Signs and Public Places bylaw. That's a permit issued by the Chief Customer Officer, and the recommendation that I've given to the officer there is to issue those permits for a further 3 years. That's an operational matter, so we're not asking councillors to make that decision, but that recognises that the operation has been going reasonably well, and it provides a measure of certainty for the operators going forward.
Thank you, Peter. Several questions in the queue. We'll start with the Deputy Mayor, Debbie Marshall-Lobb.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Chair. O te rā tēnā tātou. Thank you, Peter. I really appreciate the report. I just have a query around the cognitive test. Is that an expectation that they provide their own cognitive test? And if so, is there any check on in terms of consistency across the providers around that?
Yes, so they developed their own cognitive test. I might fail right now. We didn't want to get into the process of micromanaging that because they operate in many different markets, and what we determine may not be appropriate in other places. We have asked them to report to us if there are significant deviations from rates of pass or failure. So if it was so easy that everybody passed, we would have concerns that it wasn't significantly complex. And if there was a significant rate of failure, then we'd want to sort of look into that as well. So it's one of those things we sort of keep an eye on, but generally speaking, we're seeing, as we see with the other statistics, we haven't seen significant issues with intoxicated riding, so we think that method is working quite well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Moving online now, Councillor Hapata.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Peter. Just a question around, do we have any stats about how many members of the public have been hit by a person that's been riding a scooter?
I'll just have to check. The report has the data from the police, which would probably be the closest we can come to that. So there was one police report which recorded a collision between an e-scooter and a pedestrian. I will acknowledge that that's a police report. There may be unreported incidents, but we haven't got that data to hand. Yeah.
Okay. And I know you talked about the parking. So the parking of the scooters is up to the operators or where they park. So the question is, if they're not parked in designated areas, what is the penalty for the operator?
So the way e-scooters, so the way the permit works is we stipulate requirements for how e-scooters are to be parked. And the primary one is to leave the footpath clear, 1.5 metres of clear, unobstructed footpath width. Many of the operators provide designated parking areas, and as you saw from Mr. Love in his earlier presentation, they incentivise their users to park in those locations with credits. So as long as an e-scooter is not blocking the footpath and is keeping the public space free for people to move around, there's no penalty. If there is a situation where an e-scooter is blocking the footpath and that's reported, then the operator has 60 minutes to remedy that situation.
So is it up to a business to ring the council to say that these scooters are lying outside their business?
If there's an issue with an e-scooter, whether it's blocking the footpath or a business or any other facility, yes, then they need to ring the operators to come and ask them to take them away.
The operators or the council?
The operators, yeah.
Well, how do we get? How does a business get hold of them?
So we have all the contact details for the operators on our website. They're also the numbers are on the e-scooters themselves. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Peter. I suppose this is quite a 360 on what we had recommended to us last year, and you've explained some of the reasons for that. But some of the concerns that were raised last year around the number of operators and the number of e-scooters, they're not really being addressed currently, are they?
Correct.
So is it that because no further operators have requested permits that you think that there's no need to do a licensing system now?
Yeah, ultimately the proposal that came forward last year was in response to what we believed may happen. When we first set out on e-scooter investigations, we knew of one operator that was interested, and that ballooned to 4. Only 3 have actually applied for permits, but at the time we were concerned there's a potential for more operators to approach the city and want to establish here. I think what we've seen over the last 17 months, though, has been kind of a stabilisation around e-scooters nationally and in Palmerston North. We do have more operators in our city than most other cities. Most other cities have 1 or 2. The fact that 3 have been able to survive and operate in Palmerston North is quite remarkable. But I think that the fear that we had that there were going to be more operators knocking on our door or a sudden explosion in the number of e-scooters hasn't materialised, and I think that shows kind of the maturity of the market.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Michelladden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Peter, for the report. Just one question. You mentioned in the report on page 66 that one operator failed to meet the performance target 4 out of the 17 months. And also on page 67, we see that one operator failed on the cognitive test side of things and also the public education and campaign safety side of things as well. What usually happens in those sort of circumstances? Do you get in touch with the provider and have a conversation with them? Or?
Yes, so we meet regularly with the operators, and this is handled through the customer unit. So Jason Rosenbrock and his team are responsible for management of the permits. With the compliance audit, where those issues were identified, we've been engaging with the operators directly. We've identified the issues that we have, made some suggestions on how they can improve, and we'll be going back out to test those things again, and if there are further concerns, then we'll continue to operate with them. If there was ongoing issues that weren't being addressed, we still had the ability to suspend or even revoke the permit, which would have the consequence of removing them from the streets.
Another question. We're also requiring providers to have safety information and public education campaigns. Is it something that is the onus on the provider to develop those sort of safety campaigns, or is that something that we'll provide and enforce it on, put the onus on them to?
Again, as with the cognitive test, we want them to take that lead. We don't want to be dictating how they do these things,
cool.
as they may be using them in other markets as well, so we don't want to have to create bespoke requirements for Palmerston North unless we need to.
No, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Just a couple questions from me. Peter, is there any update at all in terms of the central government consideration of legalizing e-scooter movements in bike lanes?
The Accessible Streets package, I checked on that last week, and it's still in limbo, unfortunately. There's been no update to the information available on Accessible Streets, but I believe the expectation is that it will be moving forward at some point. I suspect it's a government priority issue.
Thank you. In terms of hours of operation, refresh my memory, did we make an adjustment sometime over the last period around the hours of operation?
So shortly after, I think it was after the first 6 weeks, we did extend it to 11 p.m. So it's now currently operating 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. Some of the operators have expressed interest in moving to 24/7 operations. That's something we haven't decided on an operational basis, but when the new permits are issued, that may be a conversation that we have, and it may move to extended hours or possibly even 24-hour operation.
Great, thanks for that update. I was interested just in your databases and ability to kind of reach into those, and also the fact that you're nearing the millionth kilometer of rides. Is there a way to actually reach in and kind of celebrate that millionth kilometer with whoever happens to be riding it?
It's a good question. I can have a conversation with Ride Report and see if they are able to give us real-time tracking to that degree, but it's certainly something we could look into. Yeah.
Thank you. Finally, and this might be more of a question for the Chief Planning Officer, but just kind of seeing this start to really I guess, become established as kind of an additional mode within a multimodal transport system. Kind of how is this influencing our thinking really around transport planning, the kind of infrastructure needs we might have, et cetera?
It's a good question. I mean, certainly in terms of our broader aspirations for the city and the transport network, e-scooters provide a really useful means of transport. In terms of getting people out of cars and assisting with carbon reductions, I guess as the use becomes more accepted, issues such as whether or not they should appropriately use cycle lanes and those sorts of things will need to be considered. But I think for the time being, it's still a sort of watch and learn and listen, and certainly, as I said, they do provide I think a growing recognition of a legitimate form of mode of transport, particularly that connection between, say, home and a bus stop and those sorts of things, so short trips. Certainly, my anecdotal evidence is they appear to be popular with the younger generation, so if it's keeping people out of cars and those sorts of things, then, so I don't, probably no specific answer in there, but certainly they're a legitimate mode of transport now that we need to be thinking about in terms of our future transport planning.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. There don't appear to be any further questions in the queue. Appreciate the presentation and response to questions. Colleagues will look to the recommendation, which is that the committee resolves to note that no changes will be made to the current method of regulating e-scooter operations, parentheses, the mobile trading permit in the signs and use of public spaces bylaw, which I'd look to move, seconded by Councillor Zabellin, and open up for any comments that colleagues might have. Starting with Councillor Naylor, thank you.
Thank you. This is a really pleasing report, and I'm, pleased with the officer's advice to continue on with something that is obviously working well. I think when there is something that's working well, it's good for our community not to put barriers in the way or make it more difficult than it needs to be. So in terms of this becoming a legitimate mode of transport going forward, and it is already, I guess the only comment I would make is that I would hope that a 24-hour service is is made available to the operators. I think given the shift work that some people work and other reasons that people might want to travel between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. May increase the usability of this as a means of transport around the city, and I think there's some real benefits for that. I think we do need to look at how we enable that going forward, but really pleased to see where it's at.
Thank you, Councillor. Moving online now to Councillor Hapata.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm quite disappointed with this recommendation. I, as a business owner, can sometimes get to work on a Friday and so on a Saturday and Sunday morning and see up to 3 to 4 scooters dumped outside our property. And it's really disappointing to hear the officer say it's up to us to ring the operator to come pick them up. I think as operators, they should be doing their job to pick up their scooters. They are, in my words, in my husband's words, they've trashed themselves because people trip over them all the time. And I get quite disappointed to hear the officer say it's up to us to ring the operators to come and pick up these pieces of quite substantial, heavy, and people have tried to pick them up. They're very heavy to pick up. I also, stepping out of our business, we have had a lot of near misses where we've been nearly knocked over by people on scooters on the footpaths, and it's really hard work. And I know other businesses that have nearly been people that have walked out of their business and have been nearly knocked over by people on scooters on the footpaths. So the sooner we can get people onto the bike lanes, the better. And I know that we're pushing that from a government point of view, but I think we should be looking at it as a bylaw rather than trying to wait for the government to do that. So disappointed with this report, disappointed with our recommendation. So I will be voting against it because I think we should be doing something stronger as a council rather than actually, 29% of people, usage, but I just think that this is a disappointing report going forward because I think a lot of retailers are really sick of the scooters on the footpaths. So that's why I'm going to basically vote against it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Back in the room with Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to, interesting thoughts, and I understand those perspectives, but this report doesn't bring that through. In actual fact, this report is actually saying that they've landed quite well and they're quite well received, and the issues with them are kind of faded after the first few months. And that would be my reflection in my comments, is that I would also agree with Councillor Naylor an openness to trial the 24/7. I can appreciate the concern probably was around the intoxication and stuff in the weekends, but I wouldn't want to leave that being the risk and fear of not opening it up for the other benefits of shift workers and the like. So I've got an openness around extending the hours, at least during weekdays, and maybe keeping away that Friday and Saturday night type of initially. So voice that. The other one too is just noting that in a city the speed is governed and it's actually a lower limit. And I think if there's concerns around the inner city, I think maybe we could just tweak those limits rather than ban them completely. I think the benefit for our city has been proven with the number of trips that people, whether they're young or old, are actually making the trip to town, and that's creating vibrancy and activity, and I think that's positive for the inner city, actually. And as a mode of transport, not everyone's got a bike and not everyone's running a car, and certainly having one car per family now is not unusual. And so as an option to kind of head in different directions, these e-scooters are actually quite a real option. They're quite affordable and to get to where you want to go would be my experience. And so I actually think this report is saying, yep, roll it over and do it again, and I'm just flagging an openness to extend the hours. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Chair. Yeah, look, I'm happy to support the recommendation not to go any further with regulation. And I think it's interesting because, you know, council is often accused of over-regulating things, of making things difficult for business and discouraging enterprise. And so I think this is one instance where officers are advising us that actually a little bit of a more of a hands-off approach is probably better. And I think when we first considered this report, you know, the e-scooters were quite new to the city, and I think it's only human nature to have a little bit of sort of concern about new things, and there was a little bit of a fear about how things might develop. But in actual fact, when you look at the evidence, you know, the stats, the numbers, for the number of trips that have been made, like nearly 1 million trips, the stats on problems, on accidents, on issues are very, very low. So, you know, let's make an evidence-based decision here. The fact is that nearly 1 million trips have been made on scooters in this city, and the problems are very, very small. So I don't see any need for us to step in and make things more difficult for operators. This is another good option for people to use instead of a car, and clearly it's a popular option. So it's interesting because, you know, some members of council are naturally more inclined towards regulation than others, and I'm probably one of those. But in this instance, I'm absolutely happy to say that we should just keep our hands off it. So good on the officers for taking a change of position, and I will embrace that myself.
Thank you. Councillor Meehan.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'm sort of in two minds. I think the report's good, and I think the stats show us that everything's running quite well. I think scooters are a good thing to have in the city. But I'd just be careful about how quickly we move forward to 24/7. People rolling out of bars at 2 and 3 in the morning and jumping on scooters will not do us good. Understand those that work those hours would suit for them. So I just think it's just something we need to be more careful about. And I would like to see regulation come in as to where they can actually ride. They seem to ride anywhere and everywhere as they please. The road, the cycle lanes, the footpaths, they can go wherever they want. Great, no problem, until somebody does get hurt by it. The stats show us that it's all going pretty well at the moment, but how many people actually ring in and make the complaint when they have a near miss? You know, so there's those ones that don't, that we need to also think about. The stats give us a certain picture. I feel a bit for what Councillor Harper has said, that they are dropped around in pathetic places. I've picked them up from outside my place, outside my driveway, and only by spotting it as I was backing out. Every chance run over. So they do get dropped in certain places. They do get left lying around certain areas, but that goes with terrain. I feel. I think they are good to have, but I just think we need to just tread carefully though. Just to say we take our hands off and just let it run, I think we need to still think about just where we go with it and how far we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Michelladden.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Just to add my voice to the debate as someone who actually uses these scooters quite regularly, I'd like to support the recommendation put before us by the officers. I do believe that e-scooters do provide new transport options for residents to travel across the city, especially being a student city. I see a lot of students using them, and they're also eco-friendly and affordable, and an affordable means of transportation. I do hear what's being said around safety and them being, lying around on footpaths and that sort of things. I guess it comes with the territory as well, and this should be expected, especially when we have a lot of people riding them, and we'll always have people who are actually responsible. Who are responsible users and you also find people that are not responsible users of these scooters, for example. So that shouldn't in itself spoil it for responsible users of these scooters. But I do hear the safety concerns that have been raised, and as we've heard also from officers and also read from the report, that we've seen a decline in terms of complaints being made around safety. And I also like the fact that council officers are placing the onus on operators to provide safety information and public education campaigns, which will sort of ramp that up and educate people on how to actually ride these scooters. I think we saw earlier on by the presentation made before us by Mr. Jackson, who actually they actually displayed pictures of them actually educating people on how to ride scooters and that sort of thing. So they're doing their best to do that, but we'll always it's the same way as people being on cars, for example. We cannot always, what I'm trying to say is that it's the same as people being on cars. We cannot stop people from acting irresponsibly, in as much as there are many rules and policies and around, how to get around. How to get around and that sort of thing. But the public education side of things that they're implementing actually helps people actually on how to, move around and actually how to operate with these scooters as well. And also in relation to speed, I ride these scooters quite a lot. And riding them around the city center, they're GPS monitored, and which means that when you're riding around the city, especially when you move around the plaza, it actually slows down. There's actually a restricted limit. So I don't see this as much as a big of an issue because they're regulated. But I think for me personally, around the safety aspect of things, is just ramping up the safety information, public education campaign things, and I would actually encourage officers to really keep an eye on that. And I also like the fact that, the point that Councillor Nella raised earlier on, which is to trial a 24-hour permit or provide operators a 24-hour sort of permit. And we live in a city where people still work probably past midnight and that sort of things, and we should actually provide them the option to ride around the city. I remember one day I was stuck somewhere in town, and I was trying to use a scooter, and I couldn't use it past 11 p.m. at night. And for those that cannot afford taxis at night or Ubers, I think that provides them another options of transportation around the city. So I think we should actually allow or help operators move in that direction or trial it for 2 or 3 months and see what we get out of it. We are a student city. We're always going to have students moving in and around the city. Buses don't operate past midnight. And it's best that we provide them these options and make sure that our students actually feel like they're part of this city and that there's something that Palmy has to offer for them. And this is one way for us to do that. So I'm fully in support of this recommendation, and I will encourage everybody else to do the same, because we're always going to have responsible drivers and irresponsible drivers, responsible scooter operators and irresponsible scooter operators. And I think that the operators are trying their best to incentivize users to actually park better, because when you park better, at a located area or in a designated area, it gives you more points or more minutes, for example, and they incentivize you to park at a better location. So we're always going to have irresponsible and responsible. So this is just what I'm trying to say. But fully in support of this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Councillor. Moving back online to Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I agree with many of the comments made, so I'll try not to repeat those. I did just want to say that I was pleased to see that the report is showing such good usage and actually goes some way to allaying many of the concerns that I know we all heard from community members about the potential impact of this. I have some sympathy for the views Councillor Harpiter was expressing, particularly around wishing that we could put scooters into the cycle lanes, but of course that decision, as she references, out of our hands, and we're advocating as part of that conversation with Waka Kotahi and central government. And I did just want to pick up on the point there about we should go and have our own bylaw. And I think we're all pretty clear that you can't use a bylaw to make something that is illegal, legal, or conversely, legal, illegal. So even though we might wish we could have a bylaw and our own Palmerston North restrictions here, we can't actually use a bylaw to put e-scooters into the cycle lanes at this stage. As others have said, I'm certainly open to looking, as this gets embedded for us, looking at extending the operating hours. Councillor Micklad made the point about our students. I think others have mentioned shift workers. I think to go to providing a service that sits alongside our public transport but goes beyond the hours where our public transport currently offers would be a sensible next step, and I hope we can get to that, but not today. Today, I'm happy to support the recommendation that's in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Zabellan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm confident from the report and what we heard in the public comment today that given the nature of the complaints and issues experienced and the frequency of them, that those could be resolved to a reasonable extent anyway through operator proactivity, because they are enterprises, they're businesses. They won't want these to be a public nuisance or to be causing any kind of uproar. There's a vested interest in having public buy-in, and support towards this. So I think it's in the operator's interests to respond to these concerns and improve things. And then I was really pleased to hear in the public comment that is already been seized, is being worked on, that there are incentives and reward systems in place. And the 18 months in, it takes time to figure out what's going to work and what's not going to work. And I'm confident that as businesses of new enterprises that there'll be a lot of proactivity to get that sailing smoothly and to continue to increase the public buy-in on it. So I'm very happy to support the current approach. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And just finally, for me, really appreciate everyone's comments. It's good to get that diversity of views and can see a continued strong interest in what's happening in micromobility here in the city. It's kind of odd that it has a name like micromobility when it's actually having quite a significant impact in terms of what we're doing. It's amazing that, we're nearly on to the millionth kilometer over less than 2 years. And would just say, I think, it's a real credit to the operators for their enthusiasm as well, and we have one in the room here today, and really appreciate, that they're actually critical to the success of this. So the kinds of issues that we've just discussed and heard about, but as well the kind of opportunities that we've just discussed and heard about, very much do sit with them to respond to. But it's really great seeing that data as well from the public comment, particularly the number of households that are thinking that they can actually, be a 2-car household rather than 3 because it's contributing, or being a 1-car household instead of 2. That's thousands of dollars a year to keep a car on the road. If we can put those kind of savings into our community through an additional service, that's absolutely fantastic. And seeing all the avoided emissions, extra road space, et cetera, is really fantastic. I would love it if there was an opportunity for officers to work with the providers to figure out who rides the millionth kilometer, even if it's a bit retrospective. I think we talked about celebrating a bit in the last agenda item. It'd be great to see a bit more celebration of these kind of things. In terms of the 24/7 operations, I acknowledge, that there are concerns there, as there are concerns with any mode of travel. We don't go around this city taking the car keys off of all the drivers at 11 o'clock. We need to be real about this. If it's going to be part of our transport system, it's going to be how we actually operate as a city. We need to think about seriously making this more available, because there are people that do have needs well beyond the hours that are currently there. I do want to speak to the challenges as well, and well acknowledge Councillor Hapeta's views and Councillor Meehan's views as well. There is an element of social license here that goes beyond the actual license on a piece of paper, and it is incumbent on the community, the users, and the operators to make sure that they maintain that social license over time. And there is a level of frustration there with people that are careless in their use, people that are careless in their parking. And there is also a quite legitimate concern around ensuring that if there are potential users that have limitations, particularly if it's related to drug use or alcohol use, that there are good preventative measures in place. So it would very much lay those ongoing challenges with the providers in terms of ensuring that those are well addressed as we look to move forward. But this is overall a very good news story, and it's great to see us be able to move forward in really quite a flexible manner now with working with some established operators who are delivering a great service here in the community. So thank you to the officers that have made that happen. Thank you to the providers that have made that happen as well. And with that, we will move to a vote. That's passed 10 votes for, 1 vote against. Colleagues, we will break now for a morning tea, come back at 11:15. the committee meeting and move to item 9 on the agenda, which is presented by Adam Jarvis. It is the notes on the Taipei 2023 Net Zero Smart Cities Summit. Welcome, Adam, and over to you when you're ready.
Sure, I just had a quick presentation to make. Just some photos, really. It's a little bit of a shame because there's an awful lot to talk about, but the best way to have done it would be to have had a full demonstration, because there's an awful lot of what they're doing there when you see in person is unbelievably impressive. Every report, every decision that's made in Taipei is made with the enormous amount of data that can be, accessed live, recombined. Decisions about scooters. We saw platforms that were able to see in real time where every scooter in the city was, where they'd been over the last week, where they'd been over the last 24 hours, how that might change with, different weather conditions and compare with the public transport. All of that was sort of available at everybody's at the fingertips of Taipei City. And it's just, they're for reasons that I touch on in the report, they're a little bit reluctant on disseminating that broadly. So there's sort of something of a preamble while I waited for the presentation, but I think the hope here is that we would be in a position that in a year's time, a year or two's time, and I don't want to speak for the digital team out of turn, but that we're really looking to learn as much as we possibly can from, I think, clearly a city that is, or a nation that is a decade or more ahead of most of the peer cities in the West in terms of what they're doing, how they're doing it, and I guess where they're looking to go as well and their ambition. This just to give you a bit of a sense of the broader trip as well, this image is of a very, very small section of a 7-metre long piece of art at the National Palace Museum in Taipei, 1350s dwelling at Fucheng in mainland China. It's a sort of incredible tapestry, and I get just a museum that's full of most incredible artisanship that I'm sort of trying to draw something of a link to between the quality and the attention to detail of their art and the attention to detail of their data systems, which we'll get to in a second. Look, just very quickly run through, we were myself, the Mayor, Chief Planning Officer, invited to attend. The conference was sponsored by the Taipei Computer Association, so our entry fees were free, our hotel was covered, the Mayor's transport was covered, and we were also provided with just an unbelievable, she called herself a receptionist, Sandy, who was just available virtually, it seemed, 24/7. We were almost embarrassed by the degree to which she would act as a translator, intermediary between us and Taipei and other councils and across the world. Nothing was ever a problem. So we were able to get an awful lot out of our 5 days there, partly as a result of that. So number of diplomatic meetings and dinners with various other cities. We see Budapest here, Taipei, Houston, the Mayor on the left there, meeting the Mayor of Taipei, exchanging gifts. There was a whole series of some summits and symposiums. This is the Mayor delivering the presentation that's included as attachment 1 in the report here. And then this is just me, I guess, trying to, just linking back to what I said before the presentation, trying to give you a bit of a sense of, from what we saw, their capabilities that they have. So you can sort of see on the extreme left, upper left of the slide here, just one of the kind of many dashboards that they have available, looking at traffic data or pedestrian data, weather data, all of it streaming live in real time and done it in a way that I guess is accessible to an everyday user in the way that you always hope data would be, rather than needing to be through some SQL query and maybe you get it back in a few days or something like that. It's all live and available for everyday users. And really on the left side of the screen here you see just very, very extensive use of computer vision AI. So using a camera and then generating hundreds of different data sets from that single camera. So not having a camera for CCTV and then another one for, or another device for cyclist monitoring or what have you. Everything that the camera sees is tracked and made available in the aggregate. One thing that we'll get to in just a moment is the just credible forethought, really, of Taipei, or Taiwan. I'm not sure how extensive these systems are across the country, but certainly in Taipei, in terms of making all of this data not only is it only captured in the aggregate, so individual personal data isn't captured, all right, as it isn't here, but there's a sort of an understanding there that when you capture so much data, even though there's no, you're not individually identifying a particular human being, there's enough what we might consider bits of information across these different data sets that you could, in theory, put that piece of data with that timestamp together with that one and so forth in order to be able to track somebody, in theory. And so they're well ahead of this, and there's a whole team there and a whole system dedicated to not only anonymizing the data, so making it so that it's still generates valid insights in the aggregate, but anonymizing it on the individual level, but also going so far, and this really impressed me, to make it unable to be reverse engineered in future by say a malicious third party, utilizing a future technology and AI in order to be able to scrape through something. So incredible dedication to, I guess, the privacy of their citizens. So one of the places we attended was taken on tour was a place called Advantech, which you could see there's mentioned in the report in terms of potential opportunity for investment in Palmerston North. But I guess this is sort of the future, not necessarily this particular device, but essentially a commodity. So Taipei is not purchasing vertically integrated systems from a particular provider that does one particular task. They buy these or a different one from a competitor that are at very, very low prices, and then load on software, which again, most of which is open source. The image identification, computer vision software, open source. So it's basically the point I'm making here is that they're using off-the-shelf cameras, off-the-shelf computing, which is sort of ruggedized for a particular purpose, like outdoor use or what have you, and then free or open source software in order to be able to process that. So the the magic, I guess, of it is all in the platform. And so that's actually, happily, quite well aligned with where we're going here in Palmerston North with our digital strategy. This is just a quick sort of overview of what that process looks like. So you can see there's a range of different data sources on the left. There are kind of Internet of Things, there are different business data and so forth. You talked about before the de-identification and the anonymisation that happens as a part of their processing, and then various data processing, putting that into a data lake, which is a term you'll hear more often over the coming months and years out of our digital team. And then there's a range of applications and artificial intelligence analytics that happens as over top of that data. And I've tried, I think this is my last slide, so I've tried to cram quite a bit into this one. But essentially, this is one of our presentations that was given to us. And if you can imagine just at this top section here, again, sort of fisheye lens a little bit, but this is one of their rooms for data presentation. The screens that you're seeing fit the entire wall, and you had space for about 8 different screens within that, and then everybody had a live sort of tablet in front of them. So essentially this is enabling whatever decision is being made, whatever discussion is being happened, any possible relevant piece of information is able to be presented live. So you can see some of the sort of analytics that were able to be kind of presented as part of that. So transport discussion, and you can have a discussion about an intervention around a particular event, say, in a particular point in time that might be quite limited in scope in terms of time. Decisions that need to be made in the space of 10 minutes in order to cordon off particular areas as a crowd grows, or decisions that are being made across multiple decades in terms of planning decisions and so forth. So just incredible, really, what's being done there. And I think in some senses the hard work's already been done by them, and they've been very open about, okay, well, I think how to put this, I think the task in front of us is not to reinvent any of this, it's just to copy it, and they're quite happy to help us along that journey, along with a community of sort of like-minded cities that we've been able to build as a result of going along and talking with people like from Leuven, who I've mentioned in the report, who are doing some incredible things, solving noise complaints automatically using data rather than requiring human intervention, so on. So, look, I think I could probably leave it there. I think there's quite a few opportunities, but I guess just very. Council's very grateful to have had the support to be able to go along from the Type A to see what they're doing, and I think there'll be a lot of value coming out of it over the next couple of years. Cheers.
Thank you, Adam, for that report and presentation. Just move to questions. First with the Deputy Mayor.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Adam, for the report. Really good to see some wonderful things on there. With regards to page 37, you mentioned that there are, in 1.2 at the bottom, the delegation was able to make a number of lasting connections with other cities, which we hope to develop into a community of practice to share ideas and lessons with. Where are we at with that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think at this stage it's very much at the sort of the officer level, just engagement with our data specialists, with specialists from the likes of Leuven and Sydney and Bangkok actually is another place. So we've got a sort of stack of business cards, starting quite small in terms of just a very down at the technical level, what is it that we've done that we could just share that doesn't require any, contextualization or kind of substantial work in order to be able to understand. So just working with cities on that are where we're at, I guess, at this stage, rather than in order to really just be able to add value immediately. There possibly might be an opportunity as we develop our systems a little further to be able to begin to share that with the likes of, say, Whanganui or, Manawatu District Council in terms of, the next step along the chain. But I think at this stage, really just trying to maximise, I guess, the flow of information out of the likes of Taipei with other people who were there at the officer level.
Thank you. At the top of page 38, second line, you mentioned that significantly reduces costs and enables a range of new capabilities to address many long-standing local government problems. What would that be, such as?
So I mentioned, you can see one such example in 2.7 with respect to the Leuven's noise issues. Hopefully I did a reasonable job of sort of encapsulating what they've been able to achieve there. But I think more generally what you see is the situation we're in, and this has been the case forever, is that everything has to be done in what we might call an analogue fashion. Local government, in order to be able to understand and act in the city that it operates in, with a few small exceptions, has to do that in a way where there's some human in the loop. Excuse me. So, the Square East upgrade a few years ago, we're in a position where monitoring of that had to be done by a staff member, who was out there every morning in order to be able to measure foot flow, traffic across that site as it was being developed. And I think in general, the result of that is that it's both understanding the city and our services is both more costly and lower resolution than we would like, in the sense that we only get perhaps a very small window into what's happening in the city at any given time. There happens to be some, pneumatic tubes out on the road in that particular location for a couple of weeks, so we have a few of these scattered about the city, and then maybe for a morning or for a week we get a bit of a picture of vehicle numbers over a particular area, but we don't have a fuller understanding of what we're not measuring. So different kinds of vehicles across that site, and we don't get that picture about it across the entire across an entire year, and to marry that data up with what happens when it's raining, how many of our cyclists are not, and so we think, so just as one example, take a cycleway development. We currently would only understand what's happening along that cycleway, again at cost, but in a particular location and for a limited period of time. What Taipei can understand is exactly what's happening across the entire stretch and pinpoint to, a space of a few metres perhaps, but certainly a block. Oh, there seems to be a drop-off in activity here. What's going on? Why is it that, most of the routes sees high usage, but then this particular one doesn't? And so that can be flagged, and you can go out and address what's probably a problem along that stretch. Whereas we would just see at the end, the numbers seem a bit low, or maybe, but we don't have any idea what that issue is. So that's on the monitoring side. It's a big question, I'm sorry. The other side of it is in terms of automation. So most of the systems that we have at the moment in terms of responding are either analogue themselves, in the sense that an officer or, either of the council or of a police officer or whoever, in the case of, say, Leuven, there needs to go out and address a particular issue. Or where there are some digital thing that's being done, it's not networked. It's not responding to live information. So one of the things that came up often in Taipei was the idea of traffic lights in New Zealand are triggered through essentially a loop of wire underneath the ground in front of where the stop box is for vehicles, right? So a system will detect that a vehicle has entered in and then queue up that that phase for that vehicle. And then, so the way that'll work is, okay, so, there's a vehicle there, it might be one vehicle, it might be 10 vehicles, who knows, there's a phase that's been queued. And that's it. And then it'll run for 30 seconds, and there'll be an extension. If a vehicle goes over that, within that 30-second period, it may be extended by another 5 seconds, another 10 seconds. So you end up with a phase, potentially, of 40 seconds long that covers 3 vehicles. And meanwhile, over here, at another part of it, because there's been an event on or something's happened, there's a huge, great big long queue of vehicles, but there's only a sensor at the very front of that queue. So the current control system has no way of knowing, okay, leave that phase going for another, twice as long or what have you. So, whereas in Taipei, their systems understand exactly what's happening, both within that intersection, what the queue lengths are, and networked with all the other intersections around. And so the system dynamically adjusts in order to maximise the flow of traffic. That's just...
I can tell you're passionate about this, and I love it. I just want to follow with 2 quick questions. You mentioned that they're probably a decade ahead of us. If we want to see it to be a smart city, how can we, I'll give you both my questions, how can we accelerate things so we get closer than a decade away? And secondly, 3 of you went over there and you had an amazing experience to see those things. To perhaps get the benefit here, I suspect that it would be beneficial to have a sustained program of professional development for council, elected members and/or staff. I see next year they've got another conference, Smart City Conference. Do you think it's beneficial for us to have a presence here, either by writing a conference synopsis and putting that in so that we too can get there at the cost of 0? Your thoughts?
So taking your first question in terms of acceleration, I think, we're actually really well placed for that. A lot of the groundwork is either been done or is currently being done in terms of moving to, modern data lake systems and out of the digital team in terms of essentially laying the platform for us to begin to scale, which is what I guess the hard bit is. The hard bit is laying the platform, and then it's a question of how quickly you want to scale after that. Once everything can talk to and be encapsulated in the data lake. So that's on the technical side of things. And then at the same time, I think partly as a result of the connections we've made, we're actually in a really great position in terms of being able to just copy, and whether that's code or systems or what have you. So I think, like I say, I think we're really well placed. In terms of the second part of your question, I think David might have had something to say on that front. I think there's certainly a lot of opportunity for continued learning and collaboration over the time, but I wouldn't necessarily be able to tell you whether or not the offer that we received in terms of all expenses paid or whatever would be extended next year. I'm not sure on the.
Thanks, Adam. Mr. Murphy, anything to add there?
Yeah, I guess in terms of an annual return to the conference, I think it's unlikely that we would be receive the level of support on an annual basis that we did for this. So I guess that would need to be weighed up against our overall training training needs and international relations budgets and considerations, those sorts of things. So one thing is, it's unfortunate the Mayor isn't here today, but one of the things that he would like to see as a result of this, and we've got some had some preliminary conversations on that, is a sort of a package or a program of response to the opportunities that we've seen coming through the LTP. So, you know, obviously myself and Adam and the Mayor were just representatives of the organisation, so there are conversations occurring with our digital solutions team about who are already thinking and operating in this space, so it's how we accelerate that. So there is a package or program that we're looking at putting together to help accelerate the smart city work for consideration as part of the LTP.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, David. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Most welcome. Final question, Councillor Zabellan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I really enjoyed this report. I'm curious if you encountered any uses for this approach for public safety or crime prevention, or whether that was covered at all in the conference.
Sure. I mean, in a sense, it's just it's another data set, in a way. So, like I mentioned, you know, they have a camera. You can train image recognition software in order to be able to detect when undesirable behaviour is happening. That's one of the data streams that they generate. And then that's networked through, and an alert can be sent to law enforcement or whatever, or a control room live. So, you know, that's one of the kind of maybe 100 things that single camera will be doing. Certainly, their crime statistics are incredibly low.
Sure, so it's like a surveillance plus type thing.
Yeah, I don't know if I could go into much more detail than that.
Sure, thank you. And I just have one more. In terms of the manpower aspect of this, because I appreciate that the automation and the digitisation of it would have much less manpower than the analogue approach that you discussed in terms of monitoring and things like that. Do you imagine we would have a reduction of required manpower, perhaps?
I think it's perhaps more a question of being able to dramatically improve the depth and the breadth of what the understanding that we have of the city. I think, you know, that would be but I mean, in terms of, you know, as we develop this, in terms of exactly what your requirements are and how deep you want to go, you know, that'll be I imagine, a discussion for future LTPs.
Sure, cool. So it's, yeah, cool. That answers my question. Thank you. Great. Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And finally, I believe, Councillor Dennison.
Apologies, Chair, for coming in so late, but I just wanted to understand how Palmerston North got the invitation to attend something like this and get everything paid. Are we seen as a national leader in this space, or what was the prompt to get us on the international stage on this topic?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So I think prior to the COVID lockdown, the offer had come out. I'm not sure how at the time that came about, but the city was certainly planning on taking a delegation prior to the COVID lockdown. And then we couldn't because of obviously the restrictions that came with COVID. But in the intervening years, the Mayor participated online in the conference, and then as a result of, I guess, that commitment to that online participation, the offer was made once the borders reopened. So there had been a connection with Taipei over, 3 or 4 years preceding the attendance of the conference.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thanks, Adam. That does clear the queue of questions. Appreciate the presentation and report. Committee, we have the resolution in front of us that the committee resolves to receive the memorandum titled Notes on the Taipei 2023 Net Zero Smart City Summit, presented 7 June 2023. I'll look to move that, seconded by Councillor Zabellan, and open up for any comments. The Deputy Mayor.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Chair, o te rei tātou. I'm sort of quite excited about this. I think there's opportunities as global citizens. We're part of a global community, and I like the notion of us sharing intelligence, sharing, and when I mean intelligence, I don't mean James Bond type stuff, but I'm talking about better understandings about data collection, how it might help us in the local government setting and so forth. And I think that Councillor Dennison was heading where I sort of thought was a good place and space, was identifying if we have a practice of excellence or best practice, it would be really good to share that in a wider forum so that one, you know, we can make those relationships and from there also demonstrate our ability and expertise in those areas. So I think there's a lot that could come from this particular journey. I'm also keen to say that sometimes we might need to pursue things in order to have things happen. Having spoken at an international conference previously, a long time ago, you know, you write the synopsis, you put an idea forward, and if you're selected, and it's a wonderful opportunity to share your knowledge with other people and for them to provide feedback or to create a relationship thereafter. I think that could be beneficial for our wider community here at Palmerston North. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My thoughts are that I guess we're at risk of underestimating just how much we are doing in this space, because it's kind of like an advancement where I had to look up what LLE meant, and it wasn't Master of Law, it was large language model, and the image-to-image abbreviation and stuff like that was kind of like foreign to me. And so that goes to show, I guess, my limitations around technology. But to appreciate that there's been a connection now on this type of leading edge technologies internationally and what it's achieving for practical outcomes for cities, I think it's really important that we stay abreast of what's happening with the progress and keep an eye on this, because it's going to need some investment, obviously, to keep those international relationships going, and then for the technology adoption once we've piloted different things around the place. And so, therefore, the point I'm really making is just to keep us as elected members up to speed with some of this stuff so we can keep our understanding up with the investments that need to be parallel made without having the lack of knowledge to understand what the benefits and how the investment aligns. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the officers as well for such a good and clear report. And I know Councillor Johnson might not agree with me on this one, but I think this also speaks of you know, the reasons why. I understand that all costs have been covered, you know, by the Taipei Computer Association, but from the international relations perspective, in terms of like you know, increasing capacity, especially in terms of budget, I think, you know, this report kind of highlights the importance of us probably having, you know, making connections with cities around the country. Around the world as global citizens. And it also gives us an opportunity to develop formal and informal partnerships with other cities to enable testing and sharing of ideas or information, as the Deputy Mayor highlighted earlier, particularly around tech innovation and data collection as well. And given that we have a number of tech companies, especially in Palmerston North, I think 2 weeks ago, the Mayor and I attended the Manawa Tech meeting or startup meeting, which was well attended by a number of tech companies around the country and also locally. And just seeing this, you know, it was very encouraging, just seeing how many tech companies are in the Manawatu, and not just getting by, but actually thriving. And just testament of why we should have and build relationships with other cities around the world, especially in our international development sort of side of things, and also gives us an opportunity to explore economic opportunities and maximize on transfer of knowledge, like the officers have highlighted or pointed out in their report, to stop reinventing the wheel, because the hard work has already been done by other people. So it's also an opportunity for us to just pick up on that work and then make some action plans for us or for ourselves and see how we can sort of move in that direction. We've already seen Christchurch, for example, is moving in that direction as a smart city. And I think for those of you going to a local government conference, there's a workshop on that as well to see how Christchurch is sort of moving in that direction. And that helps us actually collect data and all sort of data as well. And we can share that as a city, and we can see, also learn from cities like Christchurch and how they've moved in that space. So this is actually very good, and I'm very much supportive, of the work being done in that space. Of us as a council to continuously, move in the international relations space and continue to develop capacity, even increasing the budget, so that we can continue to foster and build relationships going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Just to conclude briefly, thank you to the officers picking up on the Deputy Mayor's comments around initiative. Thank you to the officers for the initiative in bringing this to this committee and giving us some insight around what is possible in terms of being a more agile and responsive city, and some of the technology along the way that can assist in that. I would say that for me, and I think a number of people in the community, the privacy side of the conversation is also quite important, and ensuring that that is very well and proactively managed is really good to see that there's a strong model there in Taipei that we're looking to adopt. And overall, just really good to see some visibility around our international activities, and some information around the leads that generates, even in this case, as Councillor Micled's reminded us, when it's funded externally. Still really good to see that information reflected back in. So thank you to the officers for that, and we'll ask for a vote. And that's 12 votes for, none against, which moves us to the first of two items on a waste theme. The first being item 11, Bryce Hosking and Natasha Hickmott. Summary of the changes announced for Aotearoa New Zealand's waste system. Welcome, Bryce. Welcome, Natasha. If you have some brief comments that you'd like to make in opening up, that'd be great, but a little bit conscious of the clock, so look forward to hearing from you.
Yes, well, morena, I can say that still, there's 5 minutes before midday. Yeah, look, happy to take the report as read. Essentially, the reason we wanted to bring this to this forum as we move into the long-term plan and the WIMP deliberations and considerations, and in that respect, with these changes, as the report highlights, will help to guide some of our options. In some cases, it will directly direct us to do certain things moving forward, so it will have an impact. So we wanted to bring this here. Probably my only concluding comment as an intro is just, this is the information we have to hand now, so things are continuing to move. There are further questions being asked of central government, and things are evolving in that respect. So as we have more information, we'll definitely continue to share that as we go. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Bryce. Natasha, anything from you before? Great, thanks. A couple questions from me just to open up. In terms of historical precedent, have we ever seen kind of this big of a step change in expectations from central government?
No, this is the biggest change since the introduction of the Waste Minimisation Act in 2008.
Thank you. And in terms of our recent efforts to kind of move the dial in terms of diversion rates or reducing waste to landfill, how much have we been moving the dial recently?
We haven't moved the dial a lot in the last few years, and I think it would be fair to say that the performance targets are a concern to us at the moment, but we are waiting for further clarification from the MFE.
Great, thank you. Finally, just on the investment side of things, there is some commentary in there around the potential of a stick in terms of waste levy revenue being removed. Is there any discussion at all around carrots? I mean, this is going a little bit towards comment, but this looks like millions of dollars of investment. Are there any investment conversations with central government around this?
So I guess the biggest carrot is the waste minimisation levy money that we receive. So I guess we can say that we are already receiving that carrot from the MFE. I also know that, and I think the report talked about it, is that there's going to be some further development from what they call action and investment plans. And those conversations is due to start shortly, actually. I've just had the email like 10 minutes ago from the MFE that the first tranche of those action and investment plans, where they will be involving officers from across all territorial authorities, will start in mid-June. So I think, as Bryce alluded to in his starting comments, there is more to come, and there's more clarification to seek from the MFE, and it's a bit of a moving and evolving discussion with the MFE at the moment. Sorry, I can't give you a lot more than that.
That's great. That's very fresh news, and must be the reason we didn't get to this item until noon. Thank you. Questions in the queue. First, Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just one question from me around the direction, I suppose, to have the food scraps collection. Is it prescribed how we should do that, or is it all around the diversion standard or whatever?
I think I know the question you're asking me, so I'll answer it by how I think you're asking, and that is, do we need to provide it via a curbside service? Is that the question you're asking me, or can we do a more decentralised approach?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Brilliant mind reading, Natasha.
Just a hint. So unfortunately it is prescribed, and it is a curbside service.
Right, okay, thank you.
Can I just follow that up? Is that one curbside service for a whole community, or could it be a network of services that provided full coverage?
I believe it's the first, but I can certainly have that conversation with the MFE. I will say that there is more guidance to come from the MFE about how this will be introduced and what it looks like, but it is certainly my interpretation of the current information that I have that it is a curbside service for the whole city, like what we do with the recycling collection.
Thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Down similar lines, under the food scraps collection on page 72 and 4.7, it talks about that it will need to be available to households in all urban areas. Obviously, there's many households that already have, adequate ways of dealing with their food waste. So is there likely to be any opt-in, opt-out options? Would that still, if there was, would that still meet the requirements?
I don't think so. It will be much like how we do the recycling service, and that where we are prepared to provide the service, we will drive past your house, we will charge you the rate to have the service available to you. People can choose not to opt in, but they cannot choose not to pay. But I guess that would actually be in some ways our decision when we actually introduce the food scrap service. And I'll go back to my previous comment, is that we are still awaiting the further details from the MFE. But again, I feel I'm quite clear from the MFE that they are strongly advocating for us to offer a service to all households like what we do with the recycling collection at the moment.
Okay. Can I just ask further, what is the rationale around, would that see, to me that looks like a disincentive for composting, home composting. Is there any understandable rationale that's provided for what seems to be a disincentive for home composting?
While on the outside it may seem like a conflict, there are a lot of things that council could collect as part of a commercial operating service that you can't actually put in your home composting. And so some of those examples I will give are things like your cooked meat, cooked bones, dairy, bread. There are a lot of things that we actively discourage people to put in their home composting because they are actually what we call vermin attractors, so they attract things like rats and mice and discourage other behaviour. They can also those things can also encourage anaerobic activity within your composting, so they actually end up causing you problems. There are a lot of different composting methods you can use at home. Not all of them will be able to deal with all of the food waste that you may generate in your household. So I'm hoping that answers the question.
Thank you.
Deputy Mayor. Asked and answered. Councillor Zabellin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both. Hey, I was looking at the targets to divert household waste to landfill, the target starting at 30% in 2026 and then moving up to 50% by 2030. I noticed that that green waste is excluded even if it is from those targets, even if it's collected by the curbside. Do you have any more information about what's going on there?
That it was a very hot topic of discussion at the recent Wasteman's conference, actually, which was asked quite a lot of the MFE staff in attendance. Their reasoning or their rationale provided to why they're not including green waste is that green waste, and I do get it, is that green waste to a point is already excluded or already diverted from other mechanisms, like people might do it at home themselves, they take it to drop-off points. We know from recent previous waste assessments that approximately 50 to 60% of the green waste that's generated within the city is already diverted without us intervening or providing a service. We also know from overseas examples and also examples in New Zealand that when you introduce a service, and if you were like green waste, that a lot of those methods that are already being used to currently divert waste, that would now then enter that stream as well. So your gain in terms of the amount of extra green waste that you would divert from, I'm saying this very badly, but the gain that you would get is quite minimal when we're already quite good at diverting green waste. So like I said, I can understand the rationale. I just find it a bit, I guess what I would want to see is that if the green waste was currently entering the waste stream, could that not be counted towards those diversion targets? Does that answer your?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. And so that leads me to multiple points, which I won't go to now. But I'm curious on the focus for targets on curbside collection rather than looking at the waste diversion as a whole and what's happening in the city. It seems to be really specific to this needs to be on your doorstep and it needs to be picked up and dealt with, as opposed to the other methods that you were talking about. Is that a question? I'm not sure that I've asked one, actually.
It's a question that I equally have, and it's on my list of questions that I'll be asking the MFE. Like, I will say that every time I ask them a question, and they answer it, I actually end up with more questions. So at the moment, it's an ongoing conversation. I'm also in conversations with a lot of territorial authorities, and so we're kind of trying to collate our thinking of how these standards or how these performance standards will be implemented and the rationale behind them. I will note, though, and I'm just going to have to check which section it's in. So section 3, there in section 3.5, there is whole waste stream targets that they want to achieve by 2030, which sits on the strategy. And I would imagine that the performance targets for curbside are a subsection of that to try to drive through those changes, those targets set under section 3.5 in the report on the strategy, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Could I just briefly follow up around those targets in 3.5? Are those national level targets or are those being cascaded down directly to each local authority?
Those are national targets, is my understanding.
Thank you. Online now, Councillor Hopeta.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks so much, Bryce and Natasha. Just one quick question. Have we done a costing on how much it'll cost the council to do collection of food scraps across the city?
Simple answer is no, but we will be coming through the WIMP review process and the LTP with some costed programs of what that will look like in terms of implementation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. There appear to be no further questions in the room. Thank you, Bryce. Thank you, Natasha. Very much appreciated. We'll move to look at the recommendation once it comes to screen. Being that the committee resolves to receive the memorandum titled Summary of the Changes Announced for Aotearoa New Zealand's Waste System, presented 7 June 2023. I'll look to move that, seconded by Councillor Zabellin, and open up for any comments. I'll just briefly comment to say it's really good to see the government setting out an ambitious agenda here. It does pose some real challenges for us as a local government in terms of how we respond. But these are a number of very useful steps forward. There are some challenges I hear around exactly how we roll things out community-wide and some questions around potentially unintended consequences. But the reality that we face right now as a nation is we are the third most wasteful nation in the OECD. So it is very good to see government moving in this space. I would have welcomed seeing container deposit as part of the movement, but seeing these other activities is really positive. The other comment I'll make is that government is going to have to get real about co-investment or some form of support around achieving this. I struggle to see how the kind of investment that is signaled through these changes can be fully priced into curbside services and be reasonable for communities. So I think we as a council need to make sure that we are making it very clear, both at an officer level and at a political level as council, that this challenge is one that we're excited about working together to achieve, but it will need some investment so it doesn't all land on us as ratepayers and residents to pick that up. So thanks again to officers for the report. We'll call for a vote. And that's passed unanimously. That moves us to item 12. I invite Peter Ridge, Senior Policy Analyst. This is an overview of regulatory and service provision options to minimize waste to landfill. Peter, we've seen and read the report. If there's some brief comments you'd like to make by way of introduction, it'd be quite welcome, and then we move to questions from there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I won't rehash the whole report, given the time available, but I will note the complexity of the question that was put. We have done our best to try and answer those questions. We've broken it down into two parts because we believe there's actually two questions there. I think I'd also note that the environment, if you forgive the pun, that we operate in is quite complex in of itself. The new waste strategy that the government has released and the impending legislation that's coming forward, as Natasha mentioned, we don't know some of those details. So being able to project how certain actions could affect behaviour is quite tricky to do in this environment when we're not sure what tools we will have at our disposal. To take one, for example, that was mentioned in both the resolution that sparked the report and in the report, licensing for commercial waste collectors in the current legislation is quite limited, but we don't know what powers we will have in the new legislation or how they will be delivered. So they could be delivered at a national level or they could be delivered at a local level. And depending on how that happens might affect how we approach that situation. So we've attempted to come up with as strong a conclusion as we can reach in this environment. Ultimately, though, I think what we are pointing to is that we have some options, we have some powers. And as we work through the new waste management and minimisation plan as part of the LTP, we can look at a range of options for how we might meet those targets that the government has set for us, which is fundamentally about maximising our waste diversion.
Great, thank you, Peter, for the extensive work put into the report and for that brief summation. Are there any questions from colleagues here? There's at least one from me. If you kind of look, Peter, at kind of the broad categories of tools that we have available, and you kind of think about the bylaws and licensing kind of on the one hand, and the potential for, you know, either direct service provision or contract law and terms and conditions in a contract on the other. If we were simply to say there's those two lumps of approaches we could take to drive outcomes, would it be fair to say that one of those is stronger than the other?
That's part of the complexity that I was alluding to. We are unique, Palmerston City Council, amongst local authorities in New Zealand, that we are the only council that has a direct service provision. We have our own trucks, our own staff, and we collect the waste directly. Most other local authorities either contract that out, and there are variations on how that is done. So that can be done as a rates-funded service, or what they call a pay-as-you-throw approach. And all of those different variations and how those services are designed can have an impact on the outcome in terms of maximising waste diversion. I don't know that I would say that there is a clear winner, but I would note that we are the only one that currently has service provision. Talking to some of my colleagues at the Wasteman's Conference, it was interesting to hear their views on why you wouldn't be a service provider yourself. The investment costs, the maintenance, and some of the risks that are presented when you run your own service that you can, to a certain extent, contract out, possibly points to why most other local authorities don't provide it directly. But we haven't gone into an analysis of those two options to identify which is stronger or more preferable in this report, but it may be something that can be explored when we work through the WIMP, the draft WIMP, to identify if there are benefits to change.
Great, thank you. There's still no other questions in the queue, so I think that's it, Peter. Really appreciate the report. So we've got a recommendation on the screen. I might suggest that we go to the additional recommendation and then come back to this. So colleagues will be aware that there is an additional recommendation here which reads that in development of the 24-34 long-term plan, Council explore a range of models for curbside waste collection service delivery, including a single provider model, with a view to improving waste minimization outcomes. I'd like to just briefly introduce that so that people can understand where that's coming from, and we'll then go to Mr. Murphy for a brief comment from staff as well. The rationale around bringing this is really around form following function. And on the function side, we've seen a big step up in terms of what's being expected from local government. And we've seen that there are some challenges in our own system in terms of lifting the diversion rates and some of the inherent inefficiencies with multiple providers. So I simply think it's time that we actually look as a council and simply ask a question, is there a better way? This is not predetermining anything in terms of whether there may or may not be. It is simply asking the work to be done to look to see if there may be a better way. There's kind of four principal themes that really drive this for me right now. The first is around central government's really strong signal around expecting a step change. The second is that as a council, we have struggled to really meaningfully move the dial in terms of significantly changing diversion rates, et cetera. And I think that suggests that some change to business as usual is going to be needed. The third point for me is really around at least a perceived inefficiency of having multiple providers that are all competing around looking for the same core resource or core service. For me, the analogy here would be if we had one company managing the Lido, one company managing Freiburg Pool, another one managing Splashhurst, or if Horizons had one company doing the Summerhill bus route, another company doing the Highbury bus route, et cetera. I think in those cases, we would be rightly asking some questions around integration and efficiency. It's simply asking that we ask those same set of questions when we look at our waste minimization model and the outcomes that we're looking for there. And finally, it's the fourth point in support really is that, to my reading of things, and acknowledge that the officers have perhaps a more nuanced view of this, I think there is some tension between us being a provider and seeking to be a regulator when we have only quite constrained tools. We have a bylaw that doesn't really get us very far, and we have 6 years of trying to create a licensing system that hasn't really given rise to licensing yet. And I think we should be weighing up and asking whether an alternative, which might be comprehensive direct service provision, or it might be through contracting terms and conditions, if we could drive some better outcomes. Again, this is just putting the question out there and asking that we begin the process of exploring this over time. I'd acknowledge that that exploration would not be comprehensive or complete by the time the long-term plan lands, but I'd like to see it begun so that we're in a trajectory of having that conversation with the community. Again, simply to put the question out there, is there a better way? So I'd ask for your support on this. And having said that, by way of introduction, I'll hand over to Mr. Murphy for any comment from staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's been a few emails and conversation about this over the last day or two and this morning. So I think this is an example where the words are really important. So council explore a range of models is I guess the key word. So obviously a full review would not be able to be complete prior to the LTP. So I think given that it is start their exploration, the officers are comfortable with that. What I would say is, as we've signalled previously, the proposal is to combine the review of the WIMP, the resource recovery plan that sits within the LTP with the LTP process. Officers have anticipated that an action similar to the words in the recommendation would have been included in the WIMP. So given that this is start the exploration, officers are comfortable with that, but I make the point that it certainly wouldn't be a full review. That is a significant piece of work.
Thank you. There's a couple in the queue. I'll just check, are either questions or are we in comment mode? Councillor Hopata, we'll go to you for either a question or a comment online first. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am definitely on a comment. I'm not keen on this recommendation, and my reason is, I don't think I'm on screen, and my reason, do you want me to start again?
We can hear you, thanks. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So my reason is that it's primarily around competition. I think that we need to keep competition going and have competition with these providers as we currently do. I think that what you're proposing is to potentially over time cut competition out, and I'm not a fan of that. I think competition is really healthy in all forms. So my view is to keep the status quo and keep it going as it currently is. So that's why I prefer to keep it as it currently stands. So that's why I would be voting against your new recommendation going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Back in the room, Councillor Zabellan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we are having to make a really big jump in this space, and there's a particular focus on curbside collections. I think it's prudent that we do take a look at what we do, how we do it, and then how does that look when it is scaled up to meet those requirements. So we have a really good idea of what that actually looks like for our community on our streets. I think I don't see this recommendation as trying to quash or having an effect of quashing any kind of competition. Those other providers will have to make this jump as well. They will have to adapt to these changes, and will be working in a regulatory system where they'll be looking to us to
look at how we're navigating this new environment. So I think it's sensible to have those kind of options identified for us that inform us as we look to transition to those new targets and a new waste environment, new legislative requirements, so that we can be clear about what our options actually are, and then we can provide greater certainty, I think, rather than quashing competition for the other providers in that space. So yeah, I hope you'll support it. I think it's getting us ahead of the game. We know what changes are coming for us, or we have a signal of what changes are coming for us, and this lines us up to have better information or be ahead of the game when we have to start looking at transitioning to that reality. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Dennison.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just in regards to this recommendation, just the words including a singular provider model, I'd be happy if that was not included, just to get the outcome of with a view to improve waste minimisation outcomes. So I don't want to get defined on that, because I kind of concur with Councillor Harpiter around the market and having competitors, and don't want to see a single provider. I think that would be detrimental long term. I think that they would control the monopoly of the market, and then we're a price taker again as residents of the city. So that's my concern, and so the only way I could see an outcome for this that would be beneficial is, it's like turning back the clock when council exited out of this provision. We used to have our own landfill and we used to have our own collection, but that's, over a decade ago, and to go and reinvent the operational model for that would be the only outcome I could see that would be beneficial if council got itself back in to be the major player in this space, but we just simply aren't, and so therefore I'd rather have market competition rather than a sole provider. So I'm going to oppose this in its current form. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I'm really happy to support this recommendation. I think this recommendation asks officers to explore a range of models, including a single provider model. This does not lock us into a decision about anything at the moment. It merely gives us the decision to inform future decision. It gives us the information to help inform future decisions. And the aim is with a view to improving waste minimisation outcomes. So I think the wording in this, I think there's some assumptions being made about what this might mean, which I think is perhaps a little bit premature to what this actual recommendation is asking, so I'm really happy to support it.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, I'm happy to support this additional recommendation. And I did just want to make the point that including the option of single provider model doesn't mean that that would be the preferred model at the end of the day. But we do need to consider all options, and a single provider model needn't necessarily be council. It could be one contractor to council. So I don't think we should make any assumptions about what that might be. And at the end of the day, the aim here is to get a better waste minimisation outcome. At the moment, we don't have much control over the waste stream because there are so many companies that are collecting the waste to landfill, and we struggle to get information from them about exactly the volumes and the content of the waste. So I think we just need to be open here to an improved model, no matter what that might be. So I'm happy to support it, including the option of a single provider model, because at this stage it's just about giving us information so that we can think about how we can improve the situation. I don't want to rule something out at this point that might subsequently be a good answer, so I'm happy to support it.
Thank you. Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I wasn't really going to comment on this item, but as per Councillor Johnson, Councillor Naylor, this particular motion here does not lock us into anything at all other than an exploratory option, and it does not preclude creating competition because obviously way down the track we would actually go through a tendering process. Pressure on our landfill is actually evidenced in the next item which we will talk about, and that is the disposal of biosolids. So the criticality of better waste management cannot be underestimated, so I'm going to support both of the
motions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Michelad.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm in favour of competition, and I love competition because it gives us an opportunity to sort of do away with the monopoly and that sort of things. But what this recommendation is actually telling us here is actually to explore a range of options or models for curbside waste collection services. So it's not us actually making a decision on this particularly. Obviously, when we get a report or when those options have been explored, we now have the opportunity to make that decision. But this is not what it's asking us here to do. And I think this is actually quite sensible. I'm happy to support this. And I think that, you know, once we get the full report, we'll get an opportunity to decide on it. But this is not asking us to make a definitive decision on this. But it's more an a report to explore a range of models, including single provider models. So I'm really happy to support this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. That's all the comments that are in the queue. So just by brief right of a reply, just remind colleagues this is the biggest change in terms of waste minimization expectations that we've seen in at least a decade, possibly a generation. It's quite a significant moment of change. And as such, it is worth asking the question, as a number of colleagues have said, this is not predetermining anything, it is asking the question in a way that ensures a range of options are brought back to us. And simply saying, really fundamentally, you know, how can we best meet the needs of our community in the future? So I'd ask you to keep a very open mind, even those that have signaled their concern with it, that we support it through this initial stage so that we can bring some information back and see if there is a better way or not. So I'd ask you all to support this and call now for a vote.
Mr. Chair, just for clarification, is the recommendations in order paper moved as well, just to receive the memorandum? If that was the case, I'd ask for a separation.
My intent was to take this and then move back to that.
Okay. Thank you for that clarity.
Thank you, colleagues. That's passed 10 votes for and 2 against. Which brings us to the substantive motion in the papers, which we'll just bring to screen. That the committee resolves to receive the memorandum titled Overview of Regulatory and Service Provision Options to Minimize Waste to Landfill, presented 7 June 2023. I'll look to move that, seconded by Councillor Zabellin. Open that up for any comments. Not seeing any. Thank you, Peter, for clearly a significant amount of work put into, as you noted, a complex area and one where there isn't necessarily a clear black and white answer. So it really did set some useful context for us as we look at where we move to next in this, and want to acknowledge the work that you've put in over obviously some amount of time to bring this to us. So it's greatly appreciated, gave us some good insight, and I think helps us find a way forward here. So with that, we'll call for a vote. That's passed 12 votes for, none against. Moving us to item 13, wastewater discharge consent project quarterly update. And we'll invite Mike Monahan, the group manager for Three Waters, and Anna Lewis to join Mike at the table to briefly introduce your report. We have read it, but welcome your introduction of it.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Mike Monahan aho. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and councillors. I'm happy to take the quarterly report as read, but I've got a few comments here just to make before we open up for questions. And the first point I want to make is try and remove any confusion around the name of this project. Acknowledging that the project is actually called the Nature Calls project. However, during the optioneering phase of the project, it developed a bit of a colloquial name of the BPO, and it's since been referred to as the BPO. BPO is actually a term in the RMA for best practical options, as councillors are aware. And once the BPO had been decided by Council in September of 21, the project moved into a very different phase. During the consenting phase, we wanted to try and move away from that tag of BPO. So we started referring internally to the project as the Wastewater Discharge Consent Programme. However, I do acknowledge that the official name is still Nature Calls, and when we have any external communications, it's always referred to as the Nature Calls project, and we will in fact refer to it internally in future correspondence with Council as the Nature Calls project as well. Further to that, councillors will also be aware that the consent was submitted on the 19th of December and therefore, it was rejected by Horizons on the 31st of March under the Section 88 of the RMA as an incomplete application. Whilst we're continuing to work through some of these issues with Horizons, we've also been progressing one or two work packages that's highlighted in the report. One work package in particular with wider implications than the Nature Calls project is the biosolids strategy. And the biosolids work package, we've asked our consultants to report back on a number of areas. One of those is the current disposal of biosolids at the Awapuni composting site, the disposal of biosolids at regional landfill, some regional solutions, and the issue of legacy sludge. Issues with the short-term impact include the current disposal methods, regional landfill options and legacy sludge. The current biosolids disposal route includes dewatering the sewage sludge on site at the Tota Road plant, transporting it just round the back to the Awapuni composting facility and creating a not-for-sale compost product that is then dispersed on the site to cap what was the old landfill. And this has proven to be a very successful option for Palmerston North City Council in beneficially reusing our biosolids. However, a report from Tonkin and Taylor at the end of last year suggested that whilst the resource consent is in place until 2028 for this operation, there is in fact only enough space left on site to continue the operation for another 2 or 3 years. This was just a desktop study, so as part of this work package, we've asked Stantec to define the actual time left for this operation. Alongside this work, investigations have begun for alternative disposal options, including disposal to landfill. And contact has been made with all regional landfill operators. And whilst this option is not favoured, there is a possibility to engage with the Bonnie Glen landfill for short-term solutions. Longer-term regional solutions would be the preferred outcome. And the work package has identified at least one potential commercial solution. This report has not been progressed as of yet, but will be reported to this committee when more information can be shared. So that's just a few brief things that's happening at the moment, and we're happy now to take the paper as read and open it up for questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mike. Anna, anything to add, or you're happy?
Thank you. There was an additional question raised about global consenting, which I can address now if you'd like.
There's a number of questions in the queue. Why don't we jump to that and see where we get to? It may well come up from colleagues. The first question's from Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Mike. It's just a question about budget. So given that we've now got to do more work on the consent and there's delays, are we anticipating that extra budget will be required, or is it more the timing of the year in which the budget is spent that's going to change?
I think it's the timing in the year that the budget will be spent. Obviously we've underspent this year due to the delays, so we're suggesting that that will become a saving, and the annual plan for next year has sufficient budget for the work we anticipate for the year.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Mike and Anna. Just a couple of questions. Have we any updates in terms of the second meeting with Horizons, the one that was scheduled for May this year? Do we have?
Yes, we do have an update. That meeting did in fact take place on, let me just find, on the 2nd of June, so last Friday. In that meeting, the councillors were presented with all the items that Horizons had issues with. What we did was we categorised those into various groups, and we had the technical experts from from both the PNCC team and the Horizons team come together at that meeting on the 2nd of June and start to address those questions at category level. So things like the land discharge, the effect on groundwater, things like that. So that meeting did occur and was it was a very successful meeting.
Will that go any way to alleviate the issue that we have for the objection?
I can take that one. I've spoken with the Horizons processing officer this morning, so the outcome from the meeting on Friday was that she would confer with her technical experts outside of the discussion we were at. She's confirmed this morning on the phone that they will continue to work through those items one by one. She said they were happy with a lot of our responses, but without prejudice, she can't give us a firm decision until such time as she's gone through the entire list. But we're anticipating a response back from them next week.
Great, thank you, and that takes care of my second question. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just a question for me. It is around kind of getting a bit more background information around global consenting strategies. And obviously that's, you know, we've already made that play in terms of seeking that ourselves, but could you just share with us if there's any information around precedent there, other councils that have been successful in taking a global approach rather than a land parcel type approach?
I'll ask you to answer that, Anna.
Thank you. Yes, global consenting is used quite regularly for sort of transportation projects. So we see that quite a lot with Waka Kotahi in terms of a regional approach, and that's been going on for quite some time now. Stormwater is often another area where we see global sort of catchment-based global consenting for discharges. I know Tauranga City, where I am from, they have one as well, so they operate under that. It's quite a normal way of going. This is actually quite a large region, and as opposed to going consent by consent, we're going to work through this global approach. When we went through this approach with our project team, Stantec's most recent example that they've been involved with was Watercare have got a wastewater overflow global consent in that they couldn't anticipate when this would happen, and they have a global kind of approach. And currently Wellington Water are seeking global wastewater consents as well. So the land discharge aspect of it is not something we've seen, but wastewater global consents are quite usual around the country in other circumstances.
Great, thank you. That's helpful. Don't see any further questions in the queue. That may mean you're off the hook at this point. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Anne. I appreciate the report and the effort. Colleagues, we'll look at the recommendation, which is that the committee resolves to receive the report titled Wastewater Treatment Plant Discharge Consent Project Quarterly Update, presented 7 June 23. I'll look to move that, seconded by Councillor Zabellin, and open it up for any comment. I'll open comment at least, just to say thank you to the officers and the consultants that have put in a lot of work. I was kind of thinking about how fast rivers change and how fast projects change, and it feels like the project's kind of moving quite dynamically in the way that rivers sometimes moves quite dynamically, and know that you're doing some really good work to keep the relationships that we need to have with the stakeholders, including Horizons in this space, and wish you well in the continued activity there. I think the point around biosolids and kind of recognizing some of the unique needs around that is well received, and we look forward to seeing that report in due course as well, because it's one area where we realize that the clock might be slightly different than it is for the overall project. So with that, we will call for a vote. And that's passed unanimously, which brings us to the final substantive item, which is item 14, opportunities for native species reintroduction in the Turitea Reserve. And that is Adam Jarvis again, Principal Climate Change and Native Bird Advisor.
Hello, councillors. I guess mostly just happy to take the report as read and answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Adam. Question, Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Chair. Thanks, Adam. Just a couple of questions. One is just about whether there's been any thought to fencing a sort of subsection of the reserve to try and keep that area predator-free and focusing future efforts on that kind of predator-free fenced piece. I understand like it's too big to fence the whole thing.
Sure. So there was a lot of analysis that was done back in the 2000s when the project was ramping up, and without being able to quote any particular figures, I think it's fair to say, just given the very rugged nature of the terrain up there, that the nature of the catchment as well, with the dam and needing to encapsulate most of that area and deal with water courses and all sorts of things, it was going to be extremely cost prohibitive.
Okay.
Furthermore, any partial enclosure would mean that you'd have to carve large amount, a buffer zone as well, which would then need to be maintained and so forth. So, talking about sort of tens of millions of dollars at the very least. And the estimates that I remember as well being in the millions annual cost.
Okay, probably wouldn't get support from that around the table. So in terms of the predator control then that's talked about in the paper, have we got adequate budget for that, or is that something that we need to reconsider in the long-term plan?
So what we're sort of slowly moving towards, as budget allows, is a new generation of self-resetting traps. So what's up there at the moment is sort of your brown box steel trap that's needs to be hand reset. So something can go off in the first night, it sits idle for 13 days and then is reset, or maybe it's not going off at all, but you still have a human being going past that, so it sort of ties back to something of what we were talking about earlier. But we're slowly moving to a newer generation of traps, the AT220 made locally, over in Whakatane, and they're proving to be extremely effective. They're quite costly. They're, as you might be aware, there's a number of self-resetting traps that have been on the market for some time that have essentially we've tried and proven to be ineffective. So whereas these are, so we're sort of slowly moving towards that, and so there's we won't know until we get there, but there's I think a reasonable expectation that we can once that network's properly deployed, that we'll be able to maintain predator numbers at very low levels without the need for the sorts of interventions that we've seen last year and that are currently ongoing in terms of protecting the Tutuwai in particular. And that's really where, once we get to that sort of space where the likes of kōkako and kiwi become more of an option without a regular annual additional bait drop operations of the like that we've been doing, which appreciate as a sort of tough ask in terms of protecting those new species in perpetuity. So does that kind of give you a bit of a picture?
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And just one last question, if I may. How are we monitoring the Tutuwai population at the moment?
So, up until so the translocation and the post-translocation monitoring was all done with a partnership through Massey University that was funded out of MBIE funding. So, you know, monitoring was essentially taken care of us for us. This year, we've managed to contract the student or the former student that was graduate. So it was managed by the professor in postdoctorate level. Was the nature of that research project. They brought on a student who became very adept at it, and we've managed to contract her in order to maintain the monitoring. I guess one of the projects that we have on board, and again ties back to the Smart City stuff, but is a AI audio monitoring of 221 going forward. So there's some research projects going on in that, so that's just would allow that to become automated, but we're probably a ways off that particular one. I would say it's been, but in a few years going forward, that's my hope that we'll be in that position to be able to just monitor all species in real time.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Just one question from me, just in terms of the iwi partners and DOC and other stakeholders, Massey, that were included. Like, how would you describe the ongoing level of engagement and interest from that group in the project at this stage?
I would say that Rangitane is continued to be highly involved and supportive of the work we're doing. Obviously, the results of the first year were disappointing. We got very unlucky with timing, but that you know, obviously, with results improving and the continued growth of taonga in the turatea, it's really encouraging. I would say DOC is really more of a sort of a consenting body than an active partner. That we're not involved, haven't been involved operationally with the project in a long time, and as I noted in the report, the northern Tararua forest is effectively unmanaged from a predator control point of view. So, and that's not something we've been able to get them to budge on. They've got limited budgets and other priorities, so you know, that's something to manage. Massey University, the ecology department's downsized quite dramatically since the start of this project, so that's not something I would necessarily anticipate a kind of a close degree of cooperation with, as we've been lucky enough to enjoy to date moving forward, although certainly sort of more from a advisory point of view. I mean, you know, it's still a great resource for us. Is that all of? Does that answer your question?
That's helpful. Yes, thank you. Seeing no further questions in the queue, thank you, Adam, for the report and in response to questions. Colleagues, we have the recommendation in front of us that the committee resolves to receive the memorandum titled Opportunities for Native Species Reintroduction in the Turatea Reserve, presented to the Sustainability Committee 7 June 2023, which I'll look to move, seconded by Councillor Zabellin, and open for any comments. Councillor Johnson.
I know we're heading for lunch, but I'll be brief. You know, as colleagues will know, this is a project close to my heart, and I'm really delighted to see that there's been a bit of an uptick since the last memorandum we got, which was a little bit depressing, to be honest. I think this is clearly like a challenging site to manage. It's not an easy ask to manage and the predator control. And I think the indications that we got from staff around the direction towards the self-resetting traps and even potentially you know, smart monitoring of the birds, I think that that's a very sensible direction to go in, because ultimately this has got to be a sustainable project over the years, and with the surrounding farmland and forestry not being predator controlled, we will need to have some solution here that works long term maintain the population. So I'm quite excited by some of the ideas that have been shared around how we might do that, and encourage colleagues to support any budget requests that might come through the long-term plan.
Thank you, Councillor. The Deputy Mayor.
Tēnā koe, Mr Chair, o te rā tātou. Councillor Johnson was very articulate and probably saying everything I wanted to say as well. It is concerning when you read about the rat population, and I suppose if we keep an eye on that. I've had, I've visited several times Maunga Tautari, and they've got a fantastic reserve there. They've got admittedly a 47 kilometre long pest-proof fence, but then they've got introduced about 28 native birds that are thriving at this moment in time. And I just see this as a fantastic project, and in our own backyard that we need to look after. And I wholeheartedly endorse this and hope too that if we need to put some funding aside for that we do so. But thank you very much. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Just finally, by way of comment, to thank the officers. I think the recommendation that triggered the report, reflected the level of enthusiasm that many of us do have for this project and for seeing it hopefully grow over time in terms of other species joining the tutuai in that bit of habitat that we're fortunate enough as a city to be managing. So appreciate the note of caution that came back through this report in terms of taking one thing at a time, and very excited to see that there is good progress and we hope a bright future for the tutuai that are calling that special place home now. So thanks to officers, thanks to the collaborators and those that have made this possible. With that, we'll call for a vote. Thank you. And that's unanimous, 12 votes for, none against, which moves us to the work schedule. On page 99, I'll just ask the Chief Planning Officer if there's any comment there.
No specific comment. I would just say we're in for a busy August committee as well, with a number of topics that will be useful in relation to the build-up to the LTP.
Thank you. I'll look to move that. Seconded by Councillor Zabellin. Open it up for any comments. There being none, we'll call for a vote. And that is passed unanimously, which moves us to the final item on the agenda, which is to return to Councillor Zabellin for karakia.
Thank you. Me inoi tātou. Kia puta ki te whaiau, ki te ao marama, whakamaua kia tīna, haumie huie, kai ki e.
Kia ora. Thanks, everyone. It's been a busy morning and bit of the afternoon. I think we're on lunch until 2 o'clock when we come back to Councillor Dennison's committee, and we might pick up any conversation about Councillor only after that.
Yes, sounds good.
Great. Thank you.